Okay, let's get started. I see more and more people trickling in, but we are going to get going. We have a good program ahead of us. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for the very first APA Sustainable Communities Division Symposium. We hope to make this an annual event, and we're very excited about the program that we have ahead of us. My name is Merrill St. and I'm the chair of the Sustainable Communities Division for 2021 and 2022. I'm also the Urban Design and Planning Studio Leader at Smithgroup's Washington, D.C. office. We're very excited for this event. We had over 500 registrants, and that really reinforces for us the fact that the topics we will be discussing are very timely and very urgent. At the end of 2022, the Sustainable Communities Division Executive Committee developed a strategic plan to guide our division's programs and events during the next couple of years. One of the main things that came out of that process was the need to provide our members with more tools and resources to address climate change, and the need to ensure that equity, diversity, and inclusion are infused in everything that we do. And so this symposium on climate change and equity is one of the ways that we're putting our words into action. In addition to the symposium, the SCD has been working on some really amazing things over the last year, and I just wanted to mention some of them. We created a number of new committees, including Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, a Partnerships Committee, which is the one that has produced the symposium, a National Planning Conference Committee, and a Memberships Committee. We've strengthened and rebooted our Sustainable Champions program to a Climate Champions program. You can find out more about that on our website. We held our annual Excellence in Sustainability Awards, and we've expanded our communications to members, including e-bulletins and social media. We integrated the Smart Cities Interest Group into SCD, and they have a new PAS report out now and a happy hour that's going to take place on January 20th to celebrate it. We've led the development of the Climate Change Policy Guide and PAS report, which you'll hear more about, and the development of the Sustainability and Resilience Speaker Series. We've also created webinars for our university sponsors, and we're getting ready to award a number of grants for students and for our membership in general for attendance to the NPC conference. We also have a new initiative called Planning 2050. Stay tuned for more information about that coming soon. This is a very exciting new program. And we're always looking for volunteers for any of these programs. So if they interest you, please check out our website and get in touch with us. We are still looking for a memberships committee chair. Before we begin the symposium, I wanted to thank all of the SCD volunteers who work so hard to make this event possible. Shannon, Donnie, Scott, Matt, Jenny, Teresa, Larissa, Prahalad, Karla, thank you so much for all that you've done to make this happen. Last but not least, I want to thank the SCD's 2021 and 2022 speakers who support what we do possible. Please get in touch, Treasurer, if you'd like to join as an annual sponsor. Now I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Roberts to introduce the symposium agenda, topics, and speakers. Shannon?
Thanks, Merrill. Just a second. Thanks so much, Merrill. As Merrill said, I'm the Partnerships Chair for the Sustainable Communities Division. This is a new focus area for the division and our first event. We're thrilled to have a wonderful lineup of subject matter experts in climate change, resilience, and equity for today's symposium. Our first session is a deep dive, Sustainable Communities Division Leadership in Climate Action and Resilience, highlighting the tools and guidance on climate change that were developed by division leadership for all planners as they integrate climate adaptation and resilience into their practices. As part of this leadership, we will be providing information on the new APA Sustainability and Resiliency CM requirement for 2022 and we'll be reintroducing the Sustainability and Resilience webinar series where planners can fulfill this new CM requirement. Our second session, Climate Migration, will be starting at 2:50 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This will be the symposium keynote address by Kara Hewitt, focusing on important topics of climate migration and its implications for planners. Additionally, Carrie will moderate our last panel, the intersectionality of climate change and equity, starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is an important topic, and we've assembled experts from across the country to discuss how our changing climate is exacerbating inequalities through flooding, extreme heat, and fire. Lastly, we have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We will be monitoring the chat and providing opportunities for questions throughout the symposium today. We look forward to hearing your questions and welcome active participation. Please note that we will be taking 10-minute breaks between the sessions. We will be posting a slide with the session times during those breaks, so you'll know when we'll be starting the next session. Lastly, as a reminder, the Zoom webinar is available for 3.5 CM credit hours. It is also being recorded and will be available as an on-demand webinar in the future. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker for session one, Matt Bucchin, who will be providing an overview of the PAS report on climate change. Matt?
All right, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, everybody. Let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see that and hear me okay? No, I'm sharing it now. All right, everybody see that? All right, thanks, Donnie. All right, well, thank you, Shannon. I appreciate you introducing me. As Shannon said, my name is Matt Bucchin. I'm a regional practice leader with Halff Associates. We are a regional architecture, planning, and engineering firm with we have 27 offices across the South. I'm also the immediate past chair to the Sustainable Communities Division, and have been one of the volunteers that have been working on a lot of these resources that we're going to talk about. But I'm particularly excited to talk about the topic of climate. From what we can all see and what we're starting to see coming down the road is that this will probably be one of the defining aspects of our careers from this point forward. Make sure I can advance here. All right, so I'm going to do a brief introduction to climate science, look at some climate change impacts, talk a little bit very briefly about mitigation adaptation, and then start to introduce some of the APA tools that the Sustainable Communities Division has been working on, and that Scott and Karla will be picking up in the next part of this session. Just to introduce the PAS report, it's going through some of its final editing right now. I'm hoping it'll hit publication maybe in the next, probably by March, as we work through the first round of comments that have come in. But it's a comprehensive resource. If you're not familiar with what a PAS report is, it's called a Planner Advisory Service. And it's one of those comprehensive documents that try to go through and provide all the information that planners would need to understand about the topic and how to move forward, and then be a springboard for some of the other tools that I'm going to talk about. So a couple of things I'll show today are referenced in the PAS report, but are also efforts that have been done by Sustainable Communities Division over the past 2 years. One other thing to mention, it is pretty broad, so I can't cover everything, but there is included with that PAS report, I think, are 14 case studies on mitigation and adaptation that have been prepared by members of Sustainable Communities Division that dive into details about what our current communities, our cities, our states, and our towns and other groups are doing to respond to the climate emergency. But we are currently dealing with a whole bunch of existential threats in our country. Over the past year or two, we've been dealing with major issues related to racial tension and economic inequality, equity in general. It's a major focus of APA and our planning profession. We, of course, have been dealing with the global pandemic. Every time we think it's going to disappear, it seems to be coming back. Hopefully this time it's the last hump before things start to stabilize. We've been dealing with our global war on terrorism. And over the past couple years, we've been also dealing with a direct attack on democracy. And all these things are incredibly important to our profession. but only one of these on this list is truly going to outlast the entire careers of everybody on this call. Climate change is something that is occurring now, and it's going to continue to occur depending on how much we do about it for the rest of our lives. So what is climate change? Differentiating it from what weather is. Weather is when you look out the window and you see kind of what's going on. But climate change is really about that statistically valid variability in global average temperatures that expand for a long period of time, oftentimes measured in decades or longer. It may be due to internal processes that are going on. We'll see a little bit of this later, as well as external forces. And then, of course, our anthropogenic or human-caused issues that are the large part of what we're dealing with right now. So this is kind of some of that introduction to the climate science. As you go into the PS report, the topic of climate science is very important. It's things that you need to be aware about so that you can speak informed about it. But it's not something that you need to be the expert in every issue. So some of the things I'm going to introduce are just to kind of give you the broad overview of it. You'll see more in the PS report. But again, as planners, we need to be informed about it, but we don't need to be the actual scientists about all these things. But some of the things you're going to hear about are greenhouse gases and what goes into our different greenhouse gases. The largest part of that is made up of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is one of them that lasts for, it can go in and last for 100 some years or so. Other ones like methane are not, they don't last as long, but they have a much greater impact, pound for pound. So each of these are something you need to be aware about. Oftentimes we'll focus on of carbon dioxide just because it is the predominant one that is what you see out there. So I like to bring this in. You won't see this in the PAS report, but just to kind of show you some visualization of kind of how people talk about, well, these things are based on natural versus human cause. So this is actually a graph borrowed from the Climate Reality project from a couple of years ago, showing the natural variability of atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions, or their levels, I should say, over the last 800,000 years. And you can see that it's gone up and it goes down. In the upper areas, you're looking at, a beautiful day in New York City. In the lower areas, you're looking at over a mile thick of ice. So the difference is, the top is where we are now, or where we were, 250 years ago, and the bottom is when we're dealing with ice ages. So let's look at how the temperature overlays with carbon dioxide emissions and see that correlation. So as you can see, there is a positive 1-for-1 relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature. So over the same 800,000 years, you can see as carbon dioxide goes up, closely following behind is temperature. And when the line goes down, temperature goes down. So when you start to factor in where we are today, right, you can see on the screen that our carbon dioxide emissions, our levels, are unprecedented, way above what they were over the last 800,000 years. We haven't really gone above 280 or 300 million parts per million over the last 800,000 years. And the last 150,000 years, 150 years due through anthropogenic or human-caused emissions, we are now exceeding the latest in December was what, 416 parts per million. Now, temperature always falls behind. It's a lagging indicator of the changes in CO2 emissions, but you can see from the science perspective, this can be generally concerning. But now when you factor in some of the projections for where the carbon dioxide emissions are projected to go over the rest of the century, you can see that it is well beyond the natural cycles and can have an extreme a detriment to the environment. So other things you need to know that don't need to be experts in is, the UN and the International Panel on Climate Change has been around for decades on a global level, looking at the issue of climate change. In the US, there's a group called the US Global Change Research Program, USCRP, that does similar assessments called the National Climate Assessments. But basically, over the past 30 years or so, the scientific community has galvanized around that we are targeting, if we do the best that we can, 1.5 degrees increase in Celsius in global average temperatures. And that's what our target is. Worst case scenario, we want to hit 2.0. And you can kind of see on this screen here, showing since the start of the Industrial Revolution around 1850, they also talk about, showing they can go back and they can show how natural processes don't account for what the human caused is. So other things you need to be aware of, don't need to be experts in, is the 2015 Paris Agreement. That's where 196 countries got together and agreed on that target of doing the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degree Fahrenheit, trying to keep the global average temperatures to that. And then in the COP, or the COP26, was just in December of this year, was the another agreement where all the countries got together to start to lay out the action plan and recommitting to that 1.5 degree target. So that's all good news. Other things you might want to be aware about that you don't need to be expert in is in the IPCC reports. This is a graphic from the latest AR6, their latest report on climate change. But in order for them to be able to run all their models and predictions on what future climates could look like, they basically set up different kind of targets so they can say, if we hit this target, this is what the impacts would be. So in the latest version in their report, their AR6 report, they laid out 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. In previous iterations, they were called RCPs, or regional concentration pathways. But basically, these are alternate climate futures depending on how well the global community mitigates or responds in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what's important here is understanding that out of the 5, only 2 provide any opportunity to limit greenhouse gas emissions to that 1.5 or 2. And we're getting pretty close to the turning point where that's going to be out of possibility. But if we were to reach all of our climate commitments across the world, it still does not get us to that level. So even though the global community is galvanizing behind starting to talk about addressing climate change, actual action, actual commitments have not gotten us to that point. So in the latest report, they're basically saying, if we were to do everything right, we'd be able to turn the curve on increases in temperatures with just 2 of those possibilities. But the other 3 has us going way above those moving forward. So the other thing that's important to understand is that one of those things that is also a lagging indicator is the sea level rise. And things that we have done over the past 150 years has been actually raising the temperature of the ocean much greater than what we always talk about or hear about of the temperature raises across land. But it's also something that will, even if we would shut off the spigot for greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow and totally turn that around, the increases in the sea level would continue to go up over the next, for the next 150, 200 years, just because of things that already happened. So this is just kind of showing what that would look like under these 5 SSPs. And then it says, if everything goes really, really wrong, there's potential for some of these higher scenarios to basically, particularly if we hit some of those cascading and triggering impacts that are possible out there, that mean sea level rise could go up 15 meters under some of these high level scenarios. Now, you would not be seeing that over your lifetimes, but it's something that could be put in motion that is inherently irreversible in human timescales. So that's some of the basic climate science terms, groups, people, targets, things of that sort that you need to be aware about. You can find more information when that PS report comes out. But again, you want to have enough information to be informed, but not enough that you get bogged down into the details. So what are some of the impacts of climate change? More frequent, intense storm events, of course, increasing temperatures, extreme heat. I know Keith should be talking about that later on. Warming ocean temperatures been happening for decades. You see in the news the declining Arctic sea ice as that contributes to sea level rise, of course, sea level rise. Then because of some of those, the increases in temperatures also increases the intensity and frequency of storm events. You have increase in the flooding, greater droughts. You can almost see an increase of the extremes. So in areas that you have a lot of rain, you get more rain and more and quicker rain. And in areas that are dry, it's projected to get drier. And then all the other impacts like are increasing fire activities, decreasing biodiversities, things that you're just starting to hear about in the planner lexicon, but it hasn't quite really infiltrated everything that we do. And then species migration, and that is a key one for a couple of reasons. It's important because for things that we don't often think about, like the migration of animal species, but it's also over time also involves human migration and things such as increased storm events like Hurricane Katrina, where hundreds of thousands of people left the city after the storm and never came back. We have all the impacts of wildfires. Well, as these wildfires occur over and over again, you'll start to see migration events pushing people in and around the country. And then longer term sea level rise. And then what do those climate change impacts do? What are they involved with? Well, it really affects all the things that planners are involved with. How we deal with energy, how do we move around our community, what types of land uses and what does our built environment look like, the infrastructure and what are we putting in, is it going to be durable enough to respond to the changing climate over time, like certain pavement conditions or certain pavement specs are done for the historical climate that's in the area. And if temperatures get hotter over time significantly, the pavement construction techniques are not meant to be as durable over time. And of course, impacts on our natural systems from increased wildfires, earlier snow melt, things of that sort. Just the issue of earlier snow melt alone. Downstream from, say, the Colorado River, all those melting areas in the Rocky Mountains, what used to melt over the course of the summer will melt earlier and affect downstream water supply issues. So, and of course, as you're seeing with the pandemic, public health as well. And then as part of these presentations, I kind of like to just hit some of the topics that are going on in the news. So today I got an email showing or talking about that 2021 was among one of the warmest, it's actually the 5th warmest year on the record. And it was also one of the most deadliest related to events coming from climate change. We had 20 disasters that killed over 600 Americans as part of disaster-related fatalities that happened. So that's today's news article. The last time I did a presentation on climate, we had, this was September 2020. I think I'm going to be out of order here. But at that time, there were 4 simultaneous hurricanes going on across the, around North America. Again, when you have intensifying storm events, but you also have the multiplication of multiple climate things going on at the same time. I was doing a presentation in August of 2021. In that month alone, we were dealing in the US with Hurricane Ida. We're dealing with the huge Dixie wildfires in California. We had unprecedented heat waves in across the Western US, the Northwestern US. And then they were having conversations about Lake Mead being, of course, the lowest point ever. And then also, it's also kind of that picture is just very kind of a symbolic of the conversation. So Lake Mead and the dam are one of the grand infrastructure projects that we did during the last 2 centuries, just like we have many other across the country, all embody things that are directly counter related to things that we should be doing now. So now, the climate's coming around and starting to impact those grand infrastructure projects that we did, where we thought that we were getting control of nature, and now nature is coming back and showing us that we don't have the control that we thought. And then going back to, here's that August 2020. So in that same thing where we had the 4 hurricanes going on, we also had major wildfires in California. We had derechos in the Midwest areas. And so just constantly in the news, more and more, you're starting to see this on a daily basis. So what can we do about it? So as I said, the IPC, the scientific community, the governments across the world have set this target of trying to keep global greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide levels and global average temperatures to not exceed that 1.5. As of the latest IPCC report just from 2 or 3 months ago, we're already at 1.07 increase over the base prior to the Industrial Revolution. And in order to do that, we're going to have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking, in order to achieve that 1.5 degree global average temperature maximum, the target is that we're trying to achieve a 50% reduction in net global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, and net zero by 2050. And that is the best chance of reaching our commitments set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. So what does that net means? It means that we are not going to be able to stop all greenhouse gas emissions, that we're going to have a combination of 2 things. We're going to have to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions, and we're actually going to have to remove existing carbon dioxide from the air. So isn't the answer just to say, let's get rid of fossil fuels, right? Let's be done with it. Well, the problem is that fossil fuels are everywhere. Everything that we do, whether it's transportation and getting around our communities in the world, how we power our society, what we do as part of our industry, how we grow our food, and how do we farm and raise our livestock, how we do our businesses and how we run our homes. Everything that we do embodies fossil fuels. And the other problem is that fossil fuels are everywhere. So everything that we are basically looking at in our offices has either been made using fossil fuels, all of our plastics, and if for some reason they haven't, like I have a plant in my office that was not made by fossil fuels, but it was transported when I got it to this office. And other things that aren't made by fossil fuels are all in the transportation process. So everything that we make, how we construct things that we use, our operations, things how we set up for maintenance, repair, and then what do we do with all this stuff when we're even done with it? Even then, it can cause increased greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a pretty heavy lift in order to achieve change moving forward. So in the climate change PAS report that'll be forthcoming, it does dive into chapters and case studies directly on climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Mitigation is that reducing our level of greenhouse gas emissions to limit that future warming. That could involve, investing in zero low emission sources, going from fossil fuels to renewable energy or clean energy. And then the other part is adaptation. And adaptation means that as the climate changes over time, as the climate has changed already, what do we need to do to reduce future impacts or reduce the vulnerability of either assets or people from these impacts? So those are kind of 2 of the main chapters that you'll be diving into in the climate change PAS report. Outside of the climate change PAS report, and we have, and they're actually linked in there as well. But the next couple of tools that I'm going to talk about were tools that were developed as part of efforts by the Sustainable Communities Division in partnership with a subgroup of our group. It's called the Climate Champions Group, as well as a partnership with the Great Plains Institute, where we were partnering together to work on some of these things. One of the ones you'll see, as we're talking about what can we do about it. So these are tools now that you can actually go to the Sustainable Community Division website and grab and start to use as a resource for moving forward with climate action in your community. But one of those is a data collection process guide. So this is a comprehensive resource that has been developed by the Sustainable Communities Division to basically pull together all the resources that we can think of related to whatever topic that you want to dive into. So resources where you can find information on energy, resources you can find information on renewable energy, things of that sort. And so we've pulled together this resource. You can see it covers buildings, renewable resources, transportation, demographics. So documents, resources, connecting you to the information that you can feed into your planning processes. The second thing that we have that's in the PS report and as well as on our website is a development review checklist. And this is where you can start to find information of how you infuse climate action into our standard processes. So oftentimes we will do long-range plans. If we're fortunate, we can do codes that are that require the private sector to do something different. But oftentimes when we get to the actual development process itself, the conversation of climate disappears. So this resource was pulled together for our planners to be able to use and infuse climate conversation into that development review process. So you can see here, it talks about the questions that we want to ask as part of applications, walks through different. It has an example community, we called it Climatopolis, but basically it provides you a resource for trying to find different ways to integrate this into your approval processes. So the categories that we have are for commercial, how do we get a better electric grid mix, how do we transition some of our energy generation to renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. In there, we also have a development review flowchart that kind of walks through opportunities for how you would fuse some of that stuff into different steps. And then I think the last one that I have for climate tools is a climate ordinance inventory. So this is a comprehensive resource that you can go in on SCD's website and you can do a word search and you can find examples of climate friendly codes from all across the country. You can search by model ordinances versus true ordinances. You can search by your jurisdiction site, city, county. You can search by population size, and you can filter things based on keywords by different sectors. So all these tools are available for moving forward. In my last couple slides, this is kind of now getting towards the culmination of the PS report. We start to identify principles for climate action. These are things that are fed into the report that are basically trying to bring to planners' attention about, in order to do something different, which is what we need to do, we need to think different. And so these 10 principles for climate action are, and they're bullet points, but they're all fleshed out in the report. Some of them are use whole system thinking. So oftentimes in our development process, in our private sector development approvals, everything is done in silos. And in order for us to respond effectively to the climate crisis, we're going to have to start thinking in systems and how does one thing lead to another, or how does one action affect 5 other things going on in the city. We need to plan and design for both resilient and sustainable outcomes. Who would have thought, I think it's 12, 13 years ago now, that I got involved with Sustainable Communities Division. And I remember the first article I wrote was defending the term sustainability. Who would have thought, a decade later, that sustainability is just embedded to everything that we do? But are we actually achieving sustainability in our work? Are we still doing the same old thing? Developing diverse and flexible cross-sector strategies, again, thinking out of those silos, prioritizing for multi-benefit outcomes. There's always going to be a limit of resources available. There's always going to be competing priorities. How can we do one thing and achieve a whole bunch of different things? Like, how can we have an action that helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time provide some other community benefit? Making sure that we're past the point of just planning for climate change. We're at the point of having to act on it. So how can we infuse the implementation actions, the process, the steps into our planning processes that we can dive right into achieving it versus having it sit on the shelf for the next 10 years. We need to set ambitious but yet achievable goals. We need to maximize our toolbox. We need to make sure that we not only talk about climate change, but we educate on the importance of it, and that everything that we do as planners fosters those equity outcomes. You just saw some of the changing things to our AICP code of ethics to talk about this. It is and will be something that we need to do in everything that we do. Couple others. We also laid out a kind of a climate planning framework with a foundation on 3 things that are essential to the climate conversation: consensus building, engagement, and education as essential tenets to everything we do, and then a series of 10 steps walking through. So if someone's sitting at their desk trying to figure out how they're going to mobilize for climate action, it provides them guidance on things they should be thinking about from step 1 in understanding who your leadership team is, who is going to be that internal, and even after post planning or whatever you're doing, who's going to be that project champion to take it forward. But the 10 steps are further fleshed out in the PS report, and we're excited to get that out in front of you. And then other things that you will not see in the PS report, but things that have been batting around is the conversation about climate resilience and understanding, going back to our roots of that people, profit, and planet, and understanding that resilience impacts everything that we do. So we've started to explore some conversations about what does institutional resilience mean for planners, and how do we better communicate that for our planners to understand that it's not just about putting something in the plan, but you're also an integral part of understanding what happens if there is a disaster, and leading the way of what that looks like from a mobilization standpoint. So these are topics that have been batting around that aren't in this PS report, but we've been exploring them for the future. And then I think my last slide, my time runs out, is the PS report ends with a planner's commitments, and it talks about four important points. So if you're sitting watching this webinar right now and you're thinking, well, how do I even get started? This seems overwhelming. The first part is to use some of these resources, go look at some of these resources, just get educated about the conversation itself. As you move forward, you're going to need to know the basics about climate science. You're going to need to know, what you can do about it, but you're going to have to take that on yourself. The next one is pulling directly from someone that you may have heard about over the last couple of years, Catherine Hayhoe. She is recently has transitioned over to the Nature Conservancy. She's always talking about climate science, but her big thing that she always talks about, she also has a book out too, but the one thing that she talks about is in order for you to make a difference, you need to talk about it. You need to talk about it in your cities and your planning process with your friends and your family. Just talking about it is something that will create change over time. And over the past 2 years, what you've seen in the media, what you've seen come out across the spectrum is just a reflection of more and more people talking about it. And that's what will eventually lead to change. Network like we do with the Sustainable Communities Division and others, or any other group that wants to talk about climate science. And then final is to actually promote policy and take action. And what that means, I'm going to turn that over. I'm going to stop sharing. So in the PS report, we talk about what policy is. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually turn this over to Scott Turner. I'll let Scott introduce himself, but Scott is actually going to overview another effort that Sustainable Communities Division has led, and that was the update to the climate change policy guide. Scott?
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled that we have had such a great turnout for this event, and kudos to Shannon and everyone else that Merrill referenced in her opening remarks. for all their efforts to put this together. We have a great program and we're just getting started. So piggybacking on what Matt described, I'm going to talk about one of the tools that Sustainable Communities Division put together. It preempts the PAS report, but it's the Climate Change Policy Guide. And this was developed in 2020, or it was published in December of 2020. Hold on a second. So a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Planning for Environmental Partners in Quincy. AICP, a registered professional engineer and a lead accredited professional. Like Matt, I'm a past chair of the Sustainable Communities Division. And recently I was elected to the APA board from Region 1. And I am one of the primary authors of the Climate Change Policy Guide that we're going to get into. And so what I want to talk about today is really just give you an introduction, background about policy guides if you're not familiar with them. Talk about who was involved, what the role of the policy guide is, discussion about the 2011, the previous policy guide, get into the comprehensive plan standards for sustaining places, which really provided the framework for the policy guide, go through the policies, and then we'll defer questions till after Karla's discussion. And so what is the policy guide? Well, the APA policy guide, it really represents APA's official position on critical planning issues. And there are 25 of them. There are 25 policy guides that are all driven and developed by APA members. These are resources for all planners. And each one of them is produced by a policy guide team. I'll get into that a little bit more. The process is you develop a draft, where you develop a framework, and then you conduct a town hall, which we did. I think we did it at the early 2019, where we can solicit feedback and get input from other planners and other interested parties. We develop a draft, we send it to the APA Legislative and Policy Committee. We also send it to the chapters and divisions following approval by the Legislative and Policy Committee to get their comments. We integrate comments from the chapters and divisions, send it to the chapter delegate assembly. I'm not sure how many of you have been involved with a delegate assembly, but it typically occurs during the national conference. And after it is voted on by the delegate assembly and comments are received, it is ultimately ratified by the APA Board of Directors. And so for this policy guide, we had a significant number of folks involved. I've got them all listed here. Matt was highly involved with this, as was Karla, who will be speaking later. But as you can see, all of the folks who have asterisks near their names are SCD members, and most are involved with the SCD leadership. So this was truly not entirely, but it was truly led by the Sustainable Communities Division. And so what is the role? It is really to assist planners formulate position statements and provide legislative recommendations. I don't know how many of you have been involved with the policy conference that typically occurs in September, but it forms the basis of legislative recommendations that planners take to Congress during Planners Day on Capitol Hill. It provides a framework for developing funding at both the federal and state levels. It creates policies that can be used for the development of comprehensive plans or climate action plans. It can help planners create their annual budgets. It can also assist in capital improvement programming at the local level. And so the first climate change policy guide was put together in 2011. And it's remarkable to think how much the world has changed between 2011 and now. The first policy guide included a smorgasbord of a lot of different things, a lot of different areas, a lot of different policies. And it was really developed before there was a strong framework for what a policy guide should look like and include. And so when you read it, and it's quite long, and as you can see, there's numerous policies in all kinds of different areas. It didn't really hold together very well. But again, we were learning, and planners were just starting to get highly involved with climate change issues. And so when our group got together to talk about how to better organize this climate change policy guide update, what we did is we relied on a PAS report that was done in 2015 by David Goschalk and David Rouse, called the Sustaining Places Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans. And when I think about this, this is really a evaluation tool for understanding how comprehensive plans address sustainability, and includes a set of standards and scoring system. It also includes procedures for recognizing how comprehensive plans include sustainability principles in those plans. And it includes 6 principles, 2 processes, and 3 attributes. And this is it's a great document. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend you get on the APA website. All the PAS reports are free to members, so you can download them all. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. This is PAS report 578. But this is a great tool for addressing sustainability. And really what we wanted to do was we wanted to tie the policy guide to another foundational document within APA. So we chose this document to do just that. And what we did is we divided the policies that in the new policy guide update, consistent with the areas that are described in the comprehensive plan standards for sustaining places. And so the beginning of the document talks about federal and state policies, and we proceed into items regarding the livable built environment, harmony with nature, resilient economy, interwoven equity, healthy communities, and responsible regionalism. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through fairly quickly through the different policies, but also understand that folded under each one of the policies is a number of different strategies. And these strategies are really the detail that I would recommend folks who are interested in this document take a look at and really integrate into their everyday lives, into their everyday planning activities. And interestingly, I remember having a discussion with Matt about this as we were developing this document. And what we felt was that this was really good planning. And it's a lot of things that planners have been doing all along, have been doing for years. It just frames everything up through the lens of climate change, and provides some really good material for folks to use in their everyday lives. And so I don't think there are any real surprises in any of these policies. I think that most folks will generally agree. One of the things that was remarkable with the process that we went through, the process that I described at the beginning, is that we had very little, I don't want to say we had few comments, but we didn't have a whole lot of recommendations on change from the town hall, from the delegate assembly, from the APA board. They really gravitated to a lot of the things that we've described in the policy guide, and which gave us confidence that we were really onto something good. So on the federal and state policies, we talk about advocating for strong national climate leadership and a national transition to a clean energy economy. Advocate for the development of a sustainable federal transportation agenda, and advocate for state climate change plans, policies, programs, and projects. Now, depending on where you are in the country, some of these are underway already. I live in Massachusetts, and we do have a state climate change plan, and we do have good policies and programs, but we understand that the politics surrounding climate change varies from region to region, and in other parts of the country, things may be a little bit different. And under each one of these policies, you got to remember there are more detailed strategies and tactics that planners can use to advocate for those. That was way beyond the scope of this presentation. If I were to talk about those, we would be here for the entire afternoon. In terms of the livable built environment, again, these are all things that are really good planning. Plan for multimodal transportation and transit-oriented development, coordinate regional transit investments with job clusters, provide green and complete streets that serve multiple functions, and provide mixed land use policies to create walkable communities. Promote development and on infill lots, and implement green building design and energy conservation. Using programs like LEED or the Living Building Challenge as a framework. Conserve and reuse historic resources rather than simply knocking down buildings and building new buildings from the ground up. And don't build within hazard zones like FEMA flood zones, which I know will be discussed quite a bit later today. Require resilient development and infrastructure, invest in smart infrastructure. Merrill mentioned the Smart Cities Interest Group. And so they are really doing a deep dive into smart infrastructure and smart cities, and provide accessible public facilities and spaces for everyone. Item C is harmony with nature. And again, all of these themes came from the Comprehensive Plan Standards for Sustaining Places. Enact policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, restore and protect environmentally sensitive areas, provide a green infrastructure network, which is something that I'm very interested in, as well as promoting green stormwater management. Advocate for policies to improve and protect air quality. Advocate for climate change adaptation, which Matt alluded to. Promote solid waste reduction, encourage water conservation and plan for a lasting water supply, and manage our wetland resources, including streams, watersheds, and floodplains. Provide a more resilient economy. Ensure that our economy is aligned with a climate strategy that maximizes economic benefits to everyone. Develop a clean energy workforce. Promote clean energy strategies on a regional level and require resource-efficient economic development. But also advocate for a community-based economic development. Provide climate-ready infrastructure capacity. Plan for post-disaster economic recovery, which is becoming more and more important as we see more and more natural disasters that are the result of climate change, and link regional food systems and conservation to economic resiliency plans. Interwoven equity, as Merrill had described, equity, diversity, inclusion is a significant part of APA's agenda. And so this is a super important part of the policy guide. Really think about including everyone when thinking about climate actions and climate policies. Connect underserved communities to multimodal transportation options and economic opportunity. Increase climate-ready affordable housing in transit-served areas. So when you go through this document and you start looking at the strategies that are folded underneath each one of these, you'll find that they kind of revert back and they tie into some of the strategies that we talked about, say in the livable built environment area, and improve green infrastructure and open space connectivity in underserved communities. Promote equitable energy and utility systems. Promote policies and programs that support an equitable, resilient economy, and with regards to health and safety, mitigate climate change risks to vulnerable population groups. With regards to healthy communities, improve community health and resilience by planning for the social determinants of health. Address public health in all stages of planning for the impacts of natural disasters, including hazard mitigation, adaptation, and response and recovery. It's kind of interesting that, as we were putting this together, we started before the pandemic, and ultimately it was approved during the pandemic, which definitely caused quite a bit of discussion about how to frame up healthy communities within this document. And lastly, apply an integrated equity, health, and climate lens to all phases of the planning process and implementation. And then with regards to regionalism, really foster regional collaboration, especially regarding climate action. Again, we endorse regional cooperation and collaboration on all planning initiatives, but especially when it comes to climate. Look at climate goals regionally as they pertain to housing, economic development, and transit, and connect communities on a regional level with different transportation options. Link open space plans with regional green infrastructure, not site-specific green infrastructure. Collect local and regional housing initiatives. Plan for economic development that balances community needs and regional climate strategy. And then coordinate, your local and regional plans when it comes to transportation, water, waste, and energy infrastructure. And lastly, coordinate regional digital connectivity and infrastructure. So that is really it. I went through this really fast. The document is chock full of information, and I would encourage you to download a free copy of it and delve into it. I think you'll see that it goes nicely with the PAS report that Matt described. And then for a deeper dive into some of SCD's efforts and things that are more, I guess, more granular or more pertinent now, I'm going to turn it over to Karla Ebenbach. Karla is going to talk about the sustainability and resilience credit. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Karla.
Great. Can everybody see my screen? I hope so. Pull up my slideshow here. All right. So thank you, Scott, and thank you, Matt. I have to say it's really, truly an honor to work with such talented and thoughtful people in our division. And I'm very excited for the events yet to come in this symposium, which is an exciting development for our division to offer it. I'm going to be talking today about the new AICP mandatory credit in sustainability and resilience, as well as the sustainability and resilience series that grew out of that new AICP requirement. As Scott said, I'm Karla Ebenbach, and I'm an independent planning consultant. And I'm also the current Secretary Treasurer of the Sustainable Communities Division, and also recent chair of the AICP task force that developed the just begun targeted CM credit in sustainability and resilience. And also I'm also the chair of the committee bringing forward the sustainability and resilience series, both of which I'm going to go over today. You may or may not have heard that the sustainability and resilience 1 hour CM requirement for planners has taken effect January 1st. And any live or on-demand educational session that qualifies for the credit hour can earn that for you if you are AICP certified. The new credit marks a shift in the AICP continuing education requirements and signifies that AICP is selecting sustainability and resilience and all the important topics that fall underneath that heading as a subject of great importance for practicing planners during the upcoming years. Several years in the future, a different subject may be selected for this rotating CM requirement. So the reconfigured mandatory AICP credits are a total of 4. 1 in law, 1 in ethics, 1 in equity, also new, and 1 in this targeted area of sustainability and resilience. So the requirement in law and ethics has been reduced slightly, but the overall number of mandatory credits has increased to 4. Folks will be able to earn regular AICP credit from sessions designated for sustainability and resilience after they've satisfied that first 1 credit hour towards that requirement. Diverse criteria define the space in which each session can qualify to offer the credit. When our task force developed the criteria, we purposely balanced the breadth of subject area with instructional objectives and specific topics that are relevant for planners. Criteria were conceived as kind of a big flexible umbrella or tent, because the field is of course broad and evolving and will continue to evolve over the lifetime of the credit. So it's a flexible space with sub areas in it, and it includes 7 sustainability learning areas and 11 resilience learning areas, and then a list of 12 topics that apply to both of those. There are also requirements for addressing equity meaningfully in each session, as well as for aiming for diverse expertise in any session that's offered. And when this is through, I'll put a link to APA's published information about the credit. But first, let's step back for a second and get some important context for this CM program. The task force that developed the criteria carefully studied and adapted and crafted definitions of sustainability and resilience that have informed both the credit criteria and also the series that I will also talk about. So just getting back to basics here, we're looking at sustainability in a planning context to mean balancing social, economic, and environmental resources, incorporating resilience and linking local actions to regional and global concerns. And meanwhile, we are looking at resilience in a planning context to mean supporting the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. Building on the establishment of the mandatory credit, I formed a new cross-divisional steering committee to develop a series of live and recorded learning sessions that will roll out over about the next 2 years, free of charge, and it will help planners to earn these credits, but more importantly, fill their knowledge gaps and provide a chance to learn from other professionals who are engaged in the work, both inside and outside the planning field, and from professionals within a variety of disciplines within planning. The objective is to strengthen the resources and tools available to all planners whose work will more and more intersect with sustainability and resilience concerns, as is clear to understand when you listen, especially to Matt's presentation. Our aim with the series is also to help planners understand the distinction between sustainability and resilience, the distinctions between adaptation and mitigation, and to build a finer grain of knowledge about the work that occurs and can occur under that umbrella. The series, which grew out of the work on the credit, is also cross-divisional and is designed to examine both basic aspects of topics as well as more intermediate versions that are more heavy on best practices and case studies. These are the 12 topic areas that fall within the sustainability and resilience credit. And we are aiming to hit each of these in the series, both at the basics level and at a more intermediate practitioners level. It's going to include everything from climate science to extreme weather, public health, social equity, economic strategies, policy tools that support sustainability and resilience planning, etc. And already we have available the first 2 sessions of the series on demand. They occurred in September, and we offered a set of 2 events called Fire and Water, Extreme Weather Trends and Community Infrastructure, for which we brought in experts from around the country to speak about the relationship of extreme weather to the planning profession. And I will also put links to these sessions in the chat. They can be viewed on demand now and are available for this new mandatory credit. And meanwhile, the next coming events will be on climate science. And the goal of these 2 sessions is to bring planners up to speed on the latest and vetted science around climate, and then illustrate the connection with that science and the planning profession. And again, it will be offered at a basics level and an intermediate level, so that folks can sort themselves out depending on how much they are currently working in that field now. The first session, the basics, for example, will ask, what do planners need to know about climate science? And in the publicity, we said, from rising seas to evolving weather patterns that include more frequent storms, heat, and fire events, there is much to understand about the intersection of climate and planning. And so the webinar will provide a concise overview of changing climate conditions and their impact on planning practice. Matt Bucchin will be one of the speakers at that event. In the intermediate roundtable, we will be asking, what are planners doing around the country to incorporate climate considerations into their practice of planning? And we'll dive a little deeper into the intersection of climate science, where it stands, where we are coming out of the recent COP, and look at case studies and examples around the country that fold in considerations of social equity, that fold in planning tools and techniques that we all might want to know about. Again, I'll put the links in the chat momentarily so that you can go directly and register for the events. But I just want to sum up by saying that the most inspiring aspect of the credit and the series for me is that it's drawing upon a very sizable group of fellow professionals who have voluntarily come together to educate and assist the profession as a whole. And by doing so, are bridging the geographic, sectoral, and other divides for the simple purpose of increasing our knowledge and the effectiveness of our work in the face of these larger challenges. And so if you'd like to participate in this series as a speaker or on our committee to help plan it, or if you have any questions about what I've presented, I hope you'll reach out to me. I will make sure that my email address is in the chat. I know we're going to have some Q&A now, so there'll be a chance to ask questions as well. And I know there's a lot of great stuff still to come in today's symposium, but I believe we'll pause now for some questions and answers for the last few presentations. So I'll hand it over to Donnie.
All right, thank you, Karla. We did receive a few questions in the chat and in the question and answer function. This first question goes out to Matt. How much did the PAS report focus on cultivating a culture shift in how we, Americans in particular, navigate our built environment? Planners have a huge role to play across the land use, housing, and transportation sectors, particularly in urban areas, to change individual behavior. Without significant transportation mode shift, we will not come close to achieving the ambitious goals we have to reduce emissions, which are largely driven by our car-centric communities. In the same way that we are recognizing that racism is systemic and highly intertwined with identity, and is therefore really difficult to tackle, our relationship to car culture, not to mention consumerism, capitalist labor practices, etc., is a structural, societal, and individual issue. Now, Matt, you did respond within the question and answer, but did you want to repeat that verbally?
Oh yeah, I'll just say that the PS report is a comprehensive resource. You'll see when it comes out, it's pretty long. It does dive into complete chapters on mitigation, adaptation, talks about all the issues that we deal with planners. But you also see, as it is a comprehensive resource, that it's not going to get into the nitty gritty of every detail. So I think in the response in the Q&A was, yeah, we talk about transportation and how that interrelates with climate issues all throughout the report, and also the case study appendices that is in there. And but that one topic alone, just like there's a climate change policy guide, just like there's a equity policy guide and a housing policy guide, and in entire PAS reports, on individual topics. You could have an entire climate change PS report just on transportation as you dive into it. So what I'm conveying is that it does cover everything probably broadly, may not get into the nitty gritty on every detail. It's just the starting point for the conversation and making sure that you can holistically understand how this all interrelates into everything that we do.
Thanks, Matt. And we also had a question on whether or not the updated PAS report is available. As Matt did respond and mention in his presentation, the PAS report is going through his final edits and will be published in the next month or so. We had a question about whether or not the PowerPoint presentations will be posted in PDF format. We will be following up with all of the presenters during today's symposium to identify whether or not those presentations are shareable, and those that are, we will be posting after the event. We did have some statements from Morty Prisament, I believe. Hopefully I got that pronunciation correct. Number one, she liked, or that person liked the question from Anonymous, which was the question that Matt just responded to, but doubts that it is something that a PAS or policy guide would address, namely socio-cultural or behavioral factors. Matt did mention Heo, who is someone who does get there from a particular angle, and in that regard, I think her communication style was extremely effective. That person's second point, another aspect of education and communicating about climate change is focusing on engagement channels of your target audience and linked to climate change. And her comment number three, terrific idea, providing planned climate science webinars. We should include point counterpoint sections to really test understanding. So thank you for those statements, Morty. I believe that is all of the questions that were received on these micro presentations, unless I missed anything, Shannon.
It does look like there was another question that came in. See here. So I guess this question, do you want to handle this question or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I could read it. So building on, reiterating the prior questions, to what extent do PAS and or SNR series address strategies and tools to individual behavior change and culture shifts? Karla just showed a list that included policy, financial, and technology tools. To the prior question's point, what about culture change tools? These might include softer approaches that bring abstract concepts or systemic policies down to tactile, emotional, personal experiences like storytelling, facilitated discussions which hit home for individuals or small groups. So I'll open that to Karla, Scott, and Matt.
I guess I'll start. I think that that's a very thoughtful question, and it definitely gets to another grain of response to climate change and its challenges. And I guess I'm taking note of that as we move the series forward. And if you'd like to connect with me separately, we could talk more about how that might be folded in.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll add to Karla's response. I think that it takes all levels of activity, whether they're softer approaches that were just described in that question, or the larger, bigger policy issues and activities that we talked about. I think everything helps, and everybody has everyone's opinion on climate change is a little bit different. You have some folks who really live it, and you have some folks who don't believe it. And I think it's how do you reach everyone? And so it takes a lot of different approaches and a lot of different actions.
And I'll throw out that if you remember that one slide about some of those other topics that have been kind of brought up and talking about the climate resilience. Well, one of those aspects was focused on social resilience as it relates to climate change. And the version that will come out is probably about at least a third shorter than it was. There was actually a whole burgeoning section on all those topics, and based on the extent of the document in APA wanting to kind of narrow it down to what do planners really need to know about mitigation? What do they need about climate science, the history, the background, mitigation, adaptation, and how do they move forward? A lot of that stuff was pulled out and discussed as maybe addressing it separately. So I know the PS report does not dive into those softer sides of the conversation, which are important. But as Karla was saying, I think it's a deeper dive in a particular issue. It's not addressed in the PS report.
We have plenty of time for questions and answers, so please keep them coming. Karla, I have one for you. I am a lead AP and I am maintaining that credit too. Will there be options for CM credits, crossovers between USGBC and APA? Are you working on that at all?
That's a wonderful suggestion. And no, I hadn't, but I will definitely look into it.
Great.
Actually, I have a I have a response to that, Shannon. So I'm a lead AP as well. And what I find is that the reporting requirements for the lead AP are not as strict as APA. A lot of the items that I use on the sustainability, resilience, climate side for my APA credits are usually accepted for lead APs. So my sense is that if there are any lead APs looking for credits, I would try to use these. And like I said, I've never had one rejected. So.
All right, great. We have two more questions that have come in, three. From Jocelyn, to what extent does APA work with schools, both elementary and secondary, to build a culture of sustainability and resilience?
So I am not aware of any specific activities by APA to do that, to work with schools. I am sure that there are planners that are working, at the local level that are likely, bringing these issues into schools, but I am not aware of a specific effort within APA to do that. But that's a great idea. And so perhaps that's something that we can dig deeper into.
All right, thanks, Scott.
Hey,
And where
Johnny, I have one more additional point on that. I think the other conversation related to that is when we think about how do we interact with our schools across the country, they are also governed by a different elected body that aren't under the purview of planners. And potentially because of that, maybe the USGBC Lead for Schools program could be a good fit for advancing that conversation. I remember I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, a decade ago, one of the first things that I did was defend sustainability when I got involved in a division. In one of the division articles, in that article, I talked about some of the advanced work that the Ohio school system was doing to advance the Green Schools program. I think that got watered down over the decade based on politics, but there are plenty of examples out there where particularly USGBC is helping to advance that conversation with a different group of people that we don't normally interact with as much. But I think it would be, as Scott was saying, a great future deep dive into the topic to how do we bridge that gap? How do we at the same time bridge that gap on other issues important to planners, like getting school placement back in walkable neighborhoods and the joint use of parks and recreation on school properties, so that it's not, separate facilities, quarter mile down the street for the city and duplicative facilities on the school that are closed outside of school hours. So there's so many different topics that we could talk about this partnership on that all advance the climate conversation.
Great, thanks, Matt. And while we have you speaking, where can we find the first set of resources and tools based on the research that you presented?
So everything that you heard about today, and Karla, correct me if I'm wrong, on information on the sustainability and resilience credit, Everything I talked about, except for the PAS report, is available through the Sustainable Communities Division website. It is apascd.com. Someone jump in if I screwed that up. It all just comes up automatically. apascd.com. There's a resources page, if I remember. Let me look it up real quick. There's a it's like a two-step process. There's a resources page, and then the bottom category is papers, policies, and guides. There are direct links to the policy guide, the data climate guide, development view checklist, the climate ordinance summary, and just the mention of the PS report that is not out yet, and then some additional resources that we have. But that'll be the landing page where all of SCD's work will be posted.
And as for the credit and the series, I posted a link in the chat for more information on APA's official material on the credit, as well as links to the on-demand sessions that are already available and the upcoming sessions in the series. We don't yet have a sort of a landing page for the series, but that's under construction, I suppose.
All right, thanks to both of you. And these next two questions are for you, Scott. Can you please clarify how harmony with nature became part of the sustainability policy report? This person, Pamela, is on the Harmony with Nature expert panel in the UN and was not aware of this, but she's delighted to learn more. And a follow-up question that Pamela had is, could you also please talk about how the Global Sustainable Development Goals informed your work and that of the new certification in sustainability? And that relates to you, Karla.
Okay, so with regards to the Harmony with Nature section of the policy guide, that was really, it was derived from the Comprehensive Plan Standards for Sustaining Places. That was the title of one of the sections in that PAS report. So going back to my presentation, I believe I said it was PAS report 578. And so perhaps you can get a copy of that report, and that might provide some insight. But you know, when we were trying to develop a framework, we struggled a lot because it's such a broad topic. It is such a wide-ranging. I mean, we could divide it any type, you know, a number of different ways. We talked about dividing our policies into adaptation versus mitigation, or adaptation and mitigation. But we just really felt like we wanted to build on other good work that APA has done. And as we look through the Comprehensive Plan Standards for Sustaining Places, we felt like it matched up, not exactly, but very closely. And so what we did was we took those larger policy areas, modified the more detailed policy areas, and developed strategies that were associated with those. So that's where the Harmony with Nature came from. And I think that the policies that we talked about really, you know, are relevant and pertinent to climate.
I think there's two other additional points on that. One is the importance of us, and maybe retroactively understanding the importance of that decision, was because we used that framework and the topics in that document, the sustainability comp plan standards for sustaining places framework. It actually, for better or worse, forced us to go find research and address topics and policies for things that we probably wouldn't have thought about. Like in one of the sections I was working on, there was a section related to you know, recycling and things of that sort. Off the top of my head, you know, I wouldn't have thought about that in the grand scheme of things. There's also something on I think constructed wetlands. It's just things that, you know, you just go on the research. They're not you know, the high profile topics, but because we were using that framework, we had to go find stuff to support it. So I think that was important. And the second thing that really sets that document up than a lot of the policy guides, or apart from a lot of the policy guides, is in addition to the policy statements that Scott was showing on the screen, almost everyone that had a series of follow-up strategies which kind of provided all this next step guidance of actually how you could, infuse that in to everything you do. And I think that that one particular decision made that document very, very usable for our planners out there versus just having the high level policy statements.
Right. I would recommend everybody download the policy guide so that they can look at the strategies. And then, we put this symposium together, especially the section we're trying to highlight all the work that we had done, but also understanding that all the work that we've done is all related to one another. And so, one of the things that I know that we talked about was that when we referenced that the comprehensive plan standards, climate issues are not the same as sustainability issues, although they are linked. And, we also talked about that with regards to sustainability and resilience credit, which, has a lot of climate items in there as well. They are all related, and they are all relevant and pertinent. So these are not black and white issues or items that sit in their own little box. That there's just a lot of overlap. And again, as I started out by saying, a lot of it is just good planning and just good policies. And but we can't really, try to tightly define any of them.
And I would just add and piggyback to that by saying that part of the process of developing the mandatory credit, the task force that worked on that spent considerable effort and energy, and Scott knows because he was part of it, talking about those definitions, talking about what elements should be included and considered under that wide umbrella of sustainability and resilience. And I think we often were thinking about the balance that we would strike between referring to APA literature that already existed versus drawing on outside sources. But clearly, in the end, we did reach out to other sources. And in terms of the UN SDGs, we did look at those at the prompting of one of the AICP commission members at one of our first reviews. And so it was part of the process to fold in these outside sources of wisdom. And I would say that the SDGs and specifically probably encourage us to include some of the more softer side of sustainability and resilience considerations. It includes poverty, it includes, so that sort of fed into the, some of the equity aspects of the credit. And then having these reference points as we moved forward with creating detailed criteria, and then later the series, it meant that we were keeping those concepts, those important ideas that came out of the SDGs in mind as we went forward.
Okay, thanks to all three of you for those thoughtful responses. James Sullivan asks, as a graduate student in environmental sustainable planning, I'm curious about the advice the panelists would give to young planners for success in their first few years in the field. I'll probably keep it to about 20 to 30-second tidbits for each of you. Could be a big answer.
Well, it's not an easy answer.
Right.
I've spent now, like Karla and Scott, I've been in the field for close to 25 years, 15 in public sector, and then the last 11 in the private sector. And a lot of our municipalities have a long way to go, particularly in certain parts of the country, to even have a conversation about climate change. So my answer to that is the first thing you should do would be, and we mentioned this in the presentation, the PS report, is to get educated on it and start talking about it. Now, an entry-level planner coming out, you may not have the credibility and the influence that you need to affect change in the political process and some of those conversations. But the more, and we talk about this in the PS report too, no matter what you're doing, is you can infuse climate friendly things in everything that you do. Like Scott said, is sometimes it comes down to good planning. So just because it's good for the climate doesn't mean that you have to call it climate. And so learning about what those things are that you can do to affect a positive climate future can be infused without bringing attention to it if you can't do that in what you do.
Yeah, my advice would be, if you're just starting out, find something that interests you, take a position in an area that interests you, and try to learn as much as you can. Because when you first start, you don't know exactly what your passion is necessarily. And so I think it's important to find what you love, but also not what you don't love necessarily. And so depending on whether you want to find a job working for a college and university, consulting firm, municipality, those are all valuable experiences and will help guide your way forward as you move through your career. Very few people stay with one place anymore for their entire career. I've been doing this for 30 years. I think I've had 4 jobs, and they're all been very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's super important to get started somehow and kind of muddle your way till you find what your passion is. And I'm always happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk about these issues in their career.
And I'll say one more point: get involved. So
that's right.
SCD.
With SCD.
Yeah.
So through SCD over the past decade, have done a deep dive into smart cities and technology, and smart cities and sustainability. The past couple of years have been a deep dive in climate. Years, and I mean years, before I could apply that to my actual job. But I was getting up to speed on those topics because of my professional involvement through through USGBC and through our APA Texas group, before I could actually apply it to what I was doing in a job. And so some of the most rewarding things that I've done in my career related to these have been through those efforts. And they're now just coming full circle, and where everybody wants to talk about what this group has been talking about for a decade.
Great, and I just posted a link to the student emerging professionals component of the SCD within the chat, so definitely check that out. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes remaining, perhaps 1 or 2 more questions. One, how might private property owners of business parks, historic properties, residential communities use policy guides or similar reports that seem to be more oriented toward municipalities and governments to build sustainable communities? So how can they contribute? What are the key differences or similarities?
So that's a great question. And so, I work for a consulting firm, and some of our clients are municipalities, and I've also worked with development companies for almost my entire career. And I have found that some development companies truly care deeply about this. In fact, I'm working on a project that is a 400,000 square foot office building that wants to be powered completely by geothermal wells. And I'm amazed at the number of geothermal wells that it's going to take to serve that building. I think that, if you're a private development company, obviously your pro forma is important. Developers are in it to make money, but there are also business reasons for getting involved, for incorporating highly sustainable practices. One of the things I'm finding is that there's a community here that has just, in Massachusetts, that has just passed, or at town meeting has a proposed bylaw that calls for electrification and really strong energy guidance regarding new buildings. So I think that on the development side, there's definitely places for it. I think that the policy guide and the PAS report can help inform where you want to go. LEED is a good reference as well. I think that most of the sustainability measures for new buildings are contained within the energy area, and that's directly related to climate. So happy to speak with you about that as well.
Thanks, Scott. And one last question. How do you suggest moving forward to change how we do the transportation improvement program? I feel like some of these projects that have been on the tip forever and MPO members don't want to let them go, but they don't meet current planning goals anymore.
I'll throw out, I think we're at a fundamental juncture in the conversation of climate change. And I happen to be located in a very conservative state who doesn't even want to talk about it. And yet the conversation from throughout, besides what you see of leadership, everything that comes out through all of the state departments and down are all talking about it behind the scenes. And we're doing projects with Texas Water Development Board, and it's infused into the first state flood plan that we're working on. And when we're seeing stuff come out through all the funding cycles, which are being passed to the MPOs, they are all tied to conversations and things linked to climate change. I think the answer to your question is that the key is all the funding cycles that are getting tied to this, that eventually we're going to cycle through and make those changes over time. And I would throw out that it's probably going to happen pretty quickly. And as you saw in the past year or two, not only do you have governments talking about what they want to do, but more importantly, you have the investors like BlackRock, the big companies out there that finance the whole world are now infusing that as part of their bottom line. Warren Buffett, same thing, that if we're moving forward, we're going to have these things addressed before we give you money. That speaks volumes to the change that will come, because without the money, nothing happens. So,
yeah, I wish that transportation agencies would take a bigger role in these issues, and especially given how much transportation contributes to the climate problem. I would love to see them step up a little bit more. But oftentimes, transportation folks, not always, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but a lot of times transportation folks are concerned about, moving people, moving cars, moving bikes, that type of things, and less so about climate-related issues. Although I am working on a sustainable mobility plan right now, and that's a pretty cool document. So.
Okay, great, thanks. And thank you for everybody, to everybody for their questions. And hopefully we provided thoughtful answers. There are about 4 unanswered questions. So for the panelists, if you wouldn't mind going in and typing your answers at some point, I think that would be most appreciated. So now I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. I believe you have a couple of closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Matt, Scott, and Karla, for giving us such a great overview of these resources that have been developed by the Sustainable Communities Division. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. So I'm going to put that slide up that I mentioned earlier today. And I will be sharing that now. We will be back online at 2:40 Eastern Standard Time, and that's when Carrie will be giving her keynote. So please tune in for that. We got a 10-minute break. So at 2:50, we will be back on. Thank you. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back for our session 2. We're really excited to have Carrie Hewlett as our climate migration keynote speaker. So Carrie, I'm gonna hand it over to you, and I will mute myself.
Great, thanks, Shannon. And if you don't mind stopping the share also, thank you. Great, yes. Okay, hi everyone, thank you. It's great to see you, and I'm really glad to be here. I took a quick look through the attendees and saw a few names that I recognize. So it's nice to see some familiar names out there, and nice to meet the rest of you. So I'm really thrilled to share some thoughts today on climate migration. And I want to thank Scott Turner in particular for inviting me, and also Shannon Roberts for everything that you've done, Shannon, to help coordinate. I really appreciate it. I know planning these symposia and all the background work that you and others are doing is a lot. So I really appreciate it. Well, I'm going to jump in and first of all, just explain some of the biases and kind of assumptions that I bring to this topic. I know that some of you on this call probably know more about this topic than I do, and some of you have probably never talked with anyone about it. So I'm really trying to hit kind of a middle ground here where I give enough context that if this is a new topic to you, you'll be able to follow along. And if it is familiar to you, there will be some new and interesting ideas, I hope. My experience is primarily with coastal flood risk. I work in the Boston area, and we deal with coastal flood risk and some inland and stormwater flooding. And so for those of you who live in places where fire or heat or drought are the main climate drivers for relocation, I hope at least most of this talk is still useful to you. But if you have to make a few leaps of logic, I hope that that will still work out. Migration is due to climate change is a global phenomenon. Migration across national borders is happening now and is projected to increase substantially. And so international migration and the effect it will have on cities in the US, particularly southern cities in the US, is really a critical lens on this topic. But for time and simplicity, I am actually not focusing today on the kind of migration that we would consider to be global across national borders. I'm really focusing today on the movement of households within the United States. When people here in the US leave somewhere because it has become, it's not viable to live there anymore due to climate change, most of them move within the same community or the same state, or certainly stay within the country for the most part, or we believe that's the case. And so to understand the mechanics of climate migration, we need to have some sort of legal and cultural context to understand, in order to understand the dynamics. And so the fact that the changing climate is the reason people need to leave their homes and communities, nonetheless, the enabling conditions for that transition are the federal, state, and local funding programs and the property and tax laws and regulations that govern the land and the structures. And so much of this talk focuses on sort of the peculiarities of those US programs and laws and regulations. So climate migration, what is it? Essentially, it's people who needing to permanently relocate because the places that they currently live or work are no longer viable due to climate change. And I think of this in terms of three kinds of categories or reasons why people need to leave due to climate change. And they are first, land loss, and second, damage or risk of damage. And third is what I would consider secondary causes or ripple effects. So let's take those each and dig into them a little bit. So the first, land loss, is probably the most obvious. Land loss due to sea level rise, for example, or erosion that has been exacerbated by development or extractive practices. Or if you're near the Arctic, the melting of permafrost, or if you're in the West, fire. This is where the land once existed in a state that could be built on and lived on, and now it's not anymore, or it's moving in that direction. So the first category is land loss. The second category is damage or future risk from damage. And so this is sort of repeat flooding from storms, for example. Again, this is what in my context in Greater Boston is incredibly relevant. It's sort of these repeat storms and flooding that comes from them, or repeat fire damage. And so the climate is simply causing a place to become too scary to live in some cases, or just too unbearable, too hot, it's too dry, or it's too wet, and folks are deeming their health and safety to be at risk. That's the second category. The third category is, as I said, what I would call second order causes, because the environment no longer supports jobs or a way of life. And so you see this most in agricultural communities, for example, or marine economies, where folks simply can't grow what they used to grow or fish what they used to fish and have to find employment and a way of life elsewhere. Or in some places, maybe it's drought because there isn't enough water to support an industry that, it has been there for a long time. So these are the reasons why people might have to leave. And so what does this look like? What does climate migration look like in the US right now? Well, first, some numbers. It's not an easy task to quantify the number of people who move because of climate change. but the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the IDMC, works to try to track these numbers. And they said that in 2020 alone, so just in the year 2020, 1.7 million people were displaced in the US and Canada due to fire and floods. And maybe the numbers are a little off or a little different, or someone else would count them differently. But the point is that a lot of people now, this is not a future condition we're talking about. A lot of people now are losing their homes because of disasters due to climate change. And so as a planner, you probably are asking yourself, well, what exactly does that look like? And the simple answer is that it's chaotic and it is extremely haphazard. Some of you might be familiar with the term managed retreat. And that term managed retreat often gets conflated with climate migration. But managed retreat, if you kind of break it down, you think about those words, managed would indicate planning ahead, or at least some sort of coordination or oversight. And retreat would indicate moving away from a threat or a risk to safety. But what we have in the US today for the vast majority of climate-induced moves is what I think of as unmanaged departure. It's a household by household decision to go somewhere else, or not so much a decision, but a feeling of being forced or actually being forced by climate change. And sometimes toward a place of greater safety, but often toward a place of equal or greater risk. And so climate migration, as I said, really does not have a lot of sort of system around it or management around it. And why is that? Well, partly and sort of primarily, in my opinion, it's because the system that we have to help people who need to move was not designed for a sort of proactive, thoughtful, whole community relocation. It was designed around emergency response. In fact, disaster response is exactly the situation that sort of all the government programs, or the vast majority of government programs that fund buyouts or home buyouts, were designed to manage. And I'm referring primarily to FEMA, including their hazard mitigation grant program, which is responsible for the majority of the funding that goes toward home buyouts. But it's not the only program. There are a few, a handful. And there are a tiny number of programs that enable government dollars to buy private property that might eventually get damaged someday, but nearly all of the public funding to buy structures and restrict future development on that same piece of land comes from emergency response programs. And so most people making these permanent moves away from homes or businesses are doing it in response to a crisis, or as kind of a post-disaster white flag of surrender. So let's try to make this more concrete for any of you who are, again, sort of new to this idea. I'm going to ask you to take a moment, sort of imagine yourself, put yourself in the position of a property owner in a place that is becoming unlivable. So you could imagine yourself in a coastal property, for example, or along the edge of a fire-prone forest, something that feels real potentially to you, maybe along the edge of a major river. And imagine that you have been that your home has been affected multiple times at this point. You've been flooded multiple times, you've seen terrifying sort of disastrous conditions, and you're just thinking, we have been lucky to date, and we would like to get out of here before something worse happens. And so what are your options? So your first option is that you can sell your home, right, in just the normal open market. And in some places, in most places, that is still a viable option, even in some of these really, really high risk places, surprisingly. But at the same time, there's also good data that shows that where some of these climate factors are making places more risky, it is getting harder to sell your home. But as of today, 2022, if you need to sell your house, even in a high risk area, chances are you probably can, but you will be passing that risk along to someone else. And that, for some people that I have worked with, is actually makes it very difficult to even contemplate selling. So that's your first option, sell if you can. The second option is stay and hope that you are lucky, right? Hope that in fact you don't get damaged or destroyed, or that you'll maybe get damaged, but if you do, then your insurance will cover it. You'll be able to rebuild. If you are in a floodplain, you probably have government subsidized flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. And so you may imagine that you'll be able to rebuild and remain. And then, of course, your third option is to stay and anticipate that you might eventually someday actually your property would be destroyed. And then at that point, the government will buy you out because you can't find another buyer. So these, just to state the obvious, are not great options. They're not great if the property that we're talking about is a second home, but they are terrible if this is your only home. Now, if you have enough wealth or enough income to manage the uncertainty and the temporary displacement, then these options are still bad, but you will probably manage. But if you are poor, then these options are simply devastating. Your house may be your only asset, and you may or may not be able to sell it. You may or may not be able to afford a new place, even if you can. If your house is damaged, even with insurance, you will likely struggle to rebuild. And you probably can't live anywhere else during the reconstruction. And if the house is destroyed, you may be left homeless while you wait for a buyout to happen, which could be years from the time of the crisis. And now let's take that experience and expand it out from the household scale to the street or the neighborhood scale. So if you in your household are facing these challenges, then many, if not all, of the households around you are in similar predicaments and have probably similar demographics. And so you would think that it would make sense for you and your neighbors to come together and to think about, how do we reduce our risk collectively, right? We're all facing this. It's all the same kind of threat. How do we work together to reduce this? Well, unfortunately, there is no funding or legal incentive to do that in most places. And there are exceedingly few resources to support any organizing efforts. So in most cases, there's no coordination or communication among neighbors. It's really each household trying to figure this out on their own. And so as a planner, I would imagine you might be thinking there has to be a better way. And I agree with you. I think there is a better way. And I'm going to share my sort of 5-minute version of what I think a better system would look like. But first, let me summarize the key challenges in the current system that I think a better system would definitely need to address. And I may be, let me see if I can, someone please confirm for me that you can see this share, because I'm not sure that I can. Shannon, can you jump in and tell me if you can see my
It says
screen
you
that I'm
started sharing, you started screen sharing. You might have to hit share again.
I see
That
what's
makes
happening.
sense.
Just, yep. Give me 1 second.
Mhm.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second because of the place where I am doing this, I actually need to, just bear with me, everyone. Apologies. I just need to be able to put this all on one screen. Forgive me all. I'm going to stop sharing while I work on this. Everyone can just sit there and contemplate all that good news I just shared. Give me 1 moment. And just to say, Shannon did run this with me before, but I had a little bit of an issue getting it reset up. Okay, here we go.
No worries. You got it?
I think I have it now. Do I have it?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right. So here are some of the existing barriers and challenges that we really need to learn how to overcome. Okay, and I want to give some credit here to a colleague of mine whose name is Anna Weber. She's a colleague at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and she and I built this list of challenges together based on our experience working with communities and buyout program managers, and also doing a big literature review. So these are kind of the 6 categories. I know there are 5 on this slide, but there's a 6th that I will share of the kinds of things that we really need to address with our current system of buying out households. So the first is time and timing. Buyouts take just far too long. They can take years, up to 5 years. This is the major disincentive for homeowners to participate in a buyout program. And the timing of the assistance rarely lines up with residents' needs because these programs are triggered by disasters. and therefore they take place after the harm has already occurred. So time and timing is challenging. The second is this incredible dependence of these programs on municipal expertise. So these programs, as I mentioned previously, are usually funded by the federal government, almost always funded by the federal government, but they are administered at the municipal scale. And so these municipal intermediaries have to be the experts on these programs. They need to understand how to apply for the money, how to receive it, how to pass it along. They apply on behalf of the household, and often the town or city has to provide a match for the funding for the buyout and then shepherd that process along for years. And so that requires expertise, it requires time, and it requires funding for the match. And also the municipalities become the owners of the land, which means that they are required to maintain that land and to steward that land, which is yet another expense and need for expertise at the municipal scale. The third is that the tools that we have to assist with this program of sort of buying homes out these tools are sort of insufficient. Many of these analytical tools and data are flawed. And some examples are that these programs rely on benefit cost analysis, which privileges economic value and leads to, for example, protecting places with high real estate value, even if they're at very high risk, and targeting places with low economic value for relocation or disinvestment, even if their risk is moderate. And so you can see the equity implications in using the tool of cost benefit analysis. Also, many of the flood and other risk mapping is outdated. It doesn't account for climate change. I think someone mentioned that previously today. And a lot of the data on past buyouts is not publicly available. In terms of program design, I already mentioned this, but existing funding and legal frameworks for government buyouts were designed for parcel by parcel acquisitions in emergency situations. And so they do not incentivize collective behavior in communities. They focus on getting people out, but not in resettling them in new places. And so all the logistics and most of the cost of relocation is left to the individual household. And because buyouts happen in a patchwork, rather than buying out a string or a swath of connected contiguous properties, they don't generally provide the risk reduction that you would hope that they would for the adjacent properties. And in fact, they can make a neighborhood start to feel disinvested in, because there are these pockets of parcels, some of which may feel neglected. And so this patchwork also limits the conservation and restoration possibilities on the newly vacant land. In terms of politics and public opinion, buyouts are a really hard sell in many communities because they are just seen as losses, seen as a loss of community. From the municipality perspective, they're a loss of tax base. And just in general, people can feel like taking a buyout is really giving up, or the community can feel like it's a disinvestment. And so finally, I want to note this sort of last bucket of challenges, which is the incredible inequities that are baked into this system. One thing that we know is that high resource or sort of wealthy jurisdictions tend to use these buyout programs more. So more of this money is going to high resource jurisdictions. And that's because low resource communities can't afford the cost sharing, they can't manage the complexity, they don't have the expertise of the staffing, like I mentioned previously. But when these high resource wealthy communities get the money, the actual properties that get bought out tend to be in the lower income parts of town. And so you can see how that inequity sort of plays out both across jurisdictions and within them. Also, these programs favor single family homeowners, and those who are left sort of disadvantaged who might want to take advantage of these programs are renters, tribes, and owners of multi-unit within multi-unit buildings. And then finally, again, the savvier you are in administering these programs, the more you've done them, then the better you are sort of taking advantage of the benefits that come along with them. And so differences in both capacity and savvy to utilize these programs, but also kind of the interpretation of the policy leads to big variations in the way these benefits are distributed. So these are the main kind of challenges. And so let me lay out in the next couple of slides the things that I think are sort of the better future, right? What would it look like to have a better system for helping people to migrate who are being displaced or forced out of their homes due to climate change? Well, for me, the biggest change would be that rather than these being sort of household by household or even municipally led, that they would be led by collective organized groups within communities. So they'd be community-led, neighborhood-wide advocacy for relocation. These are voluntary programs in the United States. A government agency might approach a homeowner or a household to offer the possibility of being bought out, but more often than not, the people taking advantage of these programs are people who are seeking the opportunity to move. But again, they're doing it household by household. So it would be a very different kind of program if people were coming together and organizing and saying, we would like to be bought out and we'd like to be bought out together. And some communities have done this, by the way, very successfully. And so what would they need? Well, they would need sort of the kind of support that all community organizers need. And that looks like, in my opinion, education on the availability of the programs, navigating the bureaucracy, some facilitation and group process to help the group do what they need to do. Also, some grief and trauma counseling. This is loss. This is a lot of loss to deal with. And it is an emotional experience to want to voluntarily give up your home and your community. And then assistance, of course, to actually relocate, not just to buy your house, but to go somewhere else. And then some real incentives in the programs to make it worth the time to try to get contiguous parcels and contiguous households to sell together. So I think that is probably the key change, but let me just go over a couple more that I think would make a huge difference in these buyout programs to address these challenges. So on timing, we just need to shift a lot of these dollars to pre-disaster rather than post-disaster. And one way to do that would be just to sort of legislatively decide that we are going to put a lot of money in that area. And I will say that the Biden administration has done some of this, more of this than in the past, and the Trump administration actually started in that direction. But another thing that could be done outside of policy is that there could be advance purchase agreements done with homeowners who know that they want to leave eventually, but they want that departure to be triggered by something that would maybe trigger them to leave anyway, such as a transfer of sale, right? If they decided they wanted to sell their house rather than selling it to a private entity, they've already promised the local government that they will sell it to them. So when they decide to sell, they sell to the city instead. Or some sort of disaster triggers that automatic sale to the city or town, or maybe death, for example. So whatever the triggering event might be, that the property goes immediately into the hands of the municipality, and that's agreed well in advance. The third would be that there are a variety of sort of innovative insurance schemes that would incentivize relocation sooner rather than later. So making your premium go up over time, for example. There are other ideas around that. On the municipal burden, sort of reducing the municipal burden to the municipalities that are buying out the properties and having to steward and restore those lands. I'll just name a couple of these. You can see the list in front of you. But I do think eliminating the match requirement or subsidizing the match requirement on a sliding scale would make a huge difference in terms of lower income communities being able to take advantage of these programs. Also, every municipality, no municipality wants to lose property, right? They want to gain taxable property. So often municipalities don't push for their residents to take advantage of these buyouts because that is a loss on the tax rolls of the municipality. So some compensation for municipalities that are proactive about going after buyouts would be really important. I'm going to move on to the next one here again, just for time. So we have some time for Q&A. The last two sort of categories of ideas that I want to share with you are that there is a municipal burden on the receiving community. So whether people move within the same community or to another community, that municipality needs to be able to receive these migrants, these climate migrants. And so I think partnering and getting some leadership from housing organizations is really important. They already know how to do this, how to help people with housing and rehousing. I think funding to have new staff to resettle those new residents is really important. And of course, incentives to build that, subsidizing that, build new housing in safe locations, some of which would be and should be subsidized. And then finally, these are really challenging, difficult, hard things for people to deal with. And so I think we need to address the mental health and social disruption components of this migration. And one way to do that is to change the experience from loss to legacy, honoring those who came before, memory making, using art to help people process this change and this transition. And finally, naming the sacrifice that people are making who do leave, because by leaving, they create these buffer zones that will protect others and give nature a chance to do its job to be that buffer space. So finally, I just will close by sharing kind of my final wish. If I had a magic wand, what would I do? What would be the one thing that I would do to help with our climate migration challenge that we are facing? And since I have a captive audience of planners, I invite you to share this wish with me. I would make a policy change across the entire country to stop all new development in floodplains just tomorrow. We would not develop any more in our floodplains, or I guess the equivalent zone for wildfire. If we never build there, we will not have to unbuild there eventually. And so to whatever extent any of you have influence in your spheres to reduce or stop the building in floodplains, you're just saving future generations from really difficult challenges. So I will end there, Shannon, and I will turn it back to you to kind of think through whether, I know I went longer than expected, so we may not have a ton of time for Q&A, but happy to take any.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I am looking at we have not had any Q&A come in yet, but please, folks, speak up about that. If you have questions for Carrie, we will be taking a 10-minute break in a few minutes before the panel discussion, and there'll be time at the end also for Q&A. So if you're thinking about things, Carrie, I like your plea for the not building in floodplains. I know in my work, and I'd like you to kind of comment on this as well. I've had clients say, well, we can mitigate wetlands. Let's develop this wetland, we can mitigate it. And I'm constantly saying, well, you can, but the water won't go away, even if you put the wetland someplace else. So what are some phrasing would you recommend for folks in addressing those types of, I think we've spent the last 50 years or so mitigating areas that we know we shouldn't be building in. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, one thing I think is really effective and powerful is to show old maps that show where the water used to be and where the flooding is today, and to just emphasize that point. I mean, I understand. I think for a long time when I would work with on engineering projects, for example, that were trying to deal with kind of wetlands regulations, the question wasn't really, they weren't worried about flooding eventually. They were worried about meeting the regulations of preserving the habitat and the, and the hydrology. And there are sort of types of engineering solutions for that. But as you just said, Shannon, the water wants to go where the water wants to go, right? And you have to, I think, as a municipality, really weigh in the balance. Do we want whatever we want built here enough that we are willing to deal with the decades or generations of flood management that come along with it? And I just think we don't ask that question often enough. I think that's the question to put before them, right?
Well, we are having questions come in, so I'll switch over to those questions. I also wanted to say that Carrie's happy to stay on during the break to answer questions. So we might not put up the slide right away if there's more questions here. To summarize, Michelle King is in the Cleveland area in a shrinking Rust Belt city. And she's curious as to how urban areas protect their long-term residents from indirect displacement from climate migrants that might be wealthier and price people out of different neighborhoods.
Yeah, Michelle, this is such an important question. It's a real challenge, and it is the same the solutions that I'm aware of that I have heard people put forward are the same kinds of solutions that any gentrification conversation ultimately tries, it sort of leads to. So the kinds of things that we hear are protections for longer term residents, right? So the kinds of things that sort of rent control, for example, and the kinds of policies and programs that are put in place to make sure that people who have been in a place for a while are able to remain even as the community around them, the economics of the community around them might change. I wish I had better answers for you, Michelle, but I think this is something that the receiving communities, which is a sort of term of art in this conversation, really have to deal with, because there are people in places that are pretty safe or safer from climate change, and more and more and more people will want to go there, right? And as you've rightly noted, people with wealth and means will be the ones who will go there first. So we do need to work hard to protect people who are already in these safer places.
So let's see. Fern Hickey has asked, could you speak more to the role of receiving communities and what frameworks could be set up locally or at state, federal level to support resettlements?
Yeah, Fern, I wish I could. I have to be honest, I too, like most of the ecosystem around this issue, have focused a lot more on the sort of dynamics around departure than the dynamics around receiving. And it's an area that I hope in 5 years I have a lot more to say, but it's also something that I myself have not given enough attention to. And so what I would say, Fern, is that you should search for some of the literature from some of the scholars who have worked and are working closely and more closely on relocation communities and on receiving communities. That would be the language to search for. And Fern, separately, if you want to email me, I can help you find some of that literature, but I wish I could. It's the half of this problem that I've spent a lot less time on.
Let's see, a question here is, in your experience, what scales of intervention from the most successful national, state, local, regional, watershed, especially in urban neighborhoods? So can you think of experiences of interventions that have been successful at the various levels?
Yeah. Let me just direct people to a couple of programs that I think are doing really well, certainly advancing in this way. I'm actually in a dialogue with some of these programs trying to do even better. But I think that, for example, the Harris County Flood Control District is doing some really innovative things on the in terms of communicating with residents, making sure that they know that these are options, working really carefully with them sort of one-on-one around their options, and really shepherding this process along. They, I believe, do take federal funding, but also have a lot of local funding, or I think most of their funding is locally derived. And that's true of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County buyout program. And then New Jersey Blue Acres is a state level program. I saw someone ask about a state, the role of states here. And New Jersey Blue Acres is a really excellent example of a state program that I think should be replicated throughout the country, that plays that role of intermediary between the federal government and the households that is expected of municipalities. But at the state level, they have so much more capacity to do it. And so these programs, I think, are doing really, really good work in trying to increase the number of people who are able to take advantage of these programs. They too, though, are hindered by a lot of the dynamics that I named already, in terms of not being able to incentivize collective behavior, in terms of having to sort of deal with the patchwork nature of this, not being able to assist much with the municipalities' responsibility for stewardship. All of those things remain challenges, but I think those programs are doing a really nice job of at least getting more people bought out who want to be bought out, and doing it in more efficient ways.
So a question here of how do you balance the risk of repetitive loss in hazard zones, such as high flood and fire areas, with takings basically of existing owners' vested rights? Are there case studies for this? I think this will probably be an issue that is going to be with us for some time, but
yeah, this is from CEO Sustainability Division.
Yeah.
So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the question is how do we balance the need for it with the challenge of our property laws, where we in this country we really we protect private property. It is part of our sort of social fabric and values. None of these buyout programs are eminent domain. They are all voluntary. And so I'm not quite sure how to answer this question, except to say that there may be an interest among some municipalities and other government sort of organizations and levels and entities to use more involuntary options for moving people out of vulnerable areas. But at the moment, that is not a big component of the system. The system that we have right now is all voluntary. So I do think that's a challenge in terms of thinking about how we really accelerate the movement of people out of vulnerable places. I think that will eventually happen through a 100% voluntary system, but or could happen, I guess, if other changes were made. But the involuntary piece of this is not a huge dynamic in the system at the moment.
I think there's two questions that are similar to this that have come in on the same vein of kind of takings versus balancing the new policies, new development. So Pamela from Coastal South Carolina is commenting about soaring real estate values in new construction. How do you limit that? And then, how do you balance? And then CEO of Sustainability Division is, how do you balance new policies that restrict new or additional developments with taking? So they're kind of similar to the last question, but maybe we could poke on that a little bit. Sounds like it's more of a carrot than a stick right now.
Yeah, definitely. But I think what Pamela is asking is a really interesting question around when does the private market start to respond to this risk, right? And is there something that we can do as people in the public sector to accelerate those signals? So it doesn't make sense that people are still buying up property in places that have proven themselves to be incredibly risky, except that, for example, the National Flood Insurance Program continues to subsidize insurance in risky places, and it doesn't align, the cost does not align with the risk, right? They're highly leveraged, and so it doesn't. So that's one reason. So one big thing we could do is that we could reform the National Flood Insurance Program. That would quite immediately have an enormous effect on the real estate market, at least in coastal areas. And the reason it hasn't been reformed is because of that immediate challenge. It is not an easy issue. I don't say that without sensitivity to the incredible challenge that creates for people whose only asset is their home and their low to moderate income, and the insurance already feels expensive. And if we were to adjust the National Flood Insurance Program to be appropriate to the level of risk, it would immediately displace an enormous number of low-income people. But that said, I don't think that there's another way out of this except to do that along with some sort of program that does work to try to compensate and try to manage for the inequities of that kind of change. But we have let it go for too long, in my opinion. So that's one example of how we try to get the private market to see these signals and to react to them.
Thank you, Carrie. I think we need to move on to our next session, session 3, which will be moderating the intersectionality of climate change and equity panel. So I'm going to hand that over to you now. I want the folks that are typing into the chat furiously in the Q&A that will hope to get to those questions in the next Q&A or while the other presenters are speaking. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce this panel.
Great. And Shannon, can you remind me, were we going to take a short break and we just used the break by talking
We just
through
used
it?
the break.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Just for the sake of the other speakers and for my sake, because I just need a couple minutes, can we take like a 2-minute break and come right back? Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
We'll
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in a moment.
Carrie, I think Chris is ready to share his video if we want to start with that, Chris.
I think that sounds great.
Sure
that sounds
thing.
great. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself and your project first? And I'll just mention for everyone that I know you can see it in the program, but we are going to hear from Chris Reed first, and then we will hear from Keith Ladd, and then from Edith Hannigan, and we'll just have each person introduce themselves before they jump into their presentation, and then we'll do the panel afterward. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, Carrie, thank you. And thanks for that nice talk. It was really illuminating in so many ways. Thanks to Scott Turner, who initially got me involved in this initiative, and to Shannon and the team for some amazing work. I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer. I have offices, my office is called STAS. We have offices in Boston and Los Angeles, and I teach at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. We typically take on very large scale, complex projects within the urban environment that are open space focused. And so projects that deal with climate change are right at the heart of so much of the work today, as are projects that deal with social equity, social justice, and environmental justice. I'm going to show you a video on a project in Boston, Moakley Park, that represents Boston's largest investment in open space since the late 19th century, when Frederick Law Olmsted was working here. Interestingly enough, it's a waterfront park. The project's managed by the city's Department of Parks and Recreation. It started as a coastal inundation project, but we quickly learned that actually stormwater flooding was the most immediate challenge from a climate standpoint, but it's also involved in the city's urban tree forestry project, which we're leading, heat study, and a number of other climate-related studies that really are looking to assist Black and Brown and lower-income multi-ethnic communities across the city. And so it's incredibly rich. I'll get the video going. And of course, one of the first things we do on projects like this is ask questions of the people who are most affected and impacted. This is Lumina, a resident of the public housing development immediately across the street, who will get us going on the journey.
Chris, I don't think we can hear the volume. At least I can't hear the volume.
I'm happy to share it on my screen too, if that's better, Chris, since we tested it out.
Why don't you go ahead? That'd be great. The further we
I
get
think
into,
you need to stop sharing and then I'll start sharing. Perfect.
I think by now we'd have figured out this technology.
Okay, that's why there's always a backup.
That's right.
That the park is free. You go to many other areas and people are charging or saying that the park is for only private use. So this park is free. It's open to anyone. There's no rules except to keep up after yourself or pick up after your dog. I mean, and if you want to like play a sport or something, just get a permit from the city. And that too doesn't cost anything. It's just a brief note to the city. I want to do something. And the city says, all right, fill out the form. Go ahead. Let me know what date.
Moakley Park, located in South Boston, is undergoing transformation. Since 2017, Boston Parks and Recreation, working with STAS Landscape Urbanism and an extensive consulting and stakeholder team, have been radically transforming this single-use recreational facility into a resilient, inclusive, and multifaceted 21st century community park. As the planning, engineering, and design teams grapple with Moakley Park, major challenges converge to complicate the process. Flooding from sea level rise and storm surge are paramount concerns. Sea level rise projections predict Moakley to be impacted by between 21 to 40 inches within 50 to 60 years. At 40 inches during a 1% storm, Floodwaters entering through the park critically inundate two public housing complexes, Mary Ellen McCormick and Old Colony, and join two other flood pathways that send water into the south end and other surrounding neighborhoods. Flooding is already common during high tide, and coupled with storm surge, Morrissey Boulevard, the approach to Moakley Park, is often underwater. Filled with harbor dredged clay, the site's flat profile and impermeable soil wreak havoc today when mild rain events cause flooding, leaving the sports fields unusable. Even in the winter months, poor drainage is visible. Compounding these risks are infrastructural challenges, both buried and on the surface. A complex web of underground utilities and challenging geotechnical conditions, coupled with a tangle of easements and dangerous 4 to 6 lane roadways, further impinge the planning and design process. In fact, the streets surrounding the park, including 2 large rotaries, are some of the most treacherous in the city, making park access restrictive, especially for the young and elderly, serving to isolate the park from the surrounding neighborhoods. Recreationally, to date, the park has been largely single use, with 55% of the park dedicated to sports, with little programming to account for age and cultural preference. And as mentioned, the park lies dormant in the winter months. As the team rethinks the park, diversity of program becomes a key equity and inclusion strategy. The existing community is varied culturally and economically, ranging from longtime older residents to young professionals to those in supportive housing, each with differing needs and expectations for the future of the park. Listening to the community's hopes and dreams for the park has been a priority for this project from day one.
I've been coming here for over 20-something years, and I like it. And I always bring the kids out because I learned a sick kid is not the best kid, but a healthy kid is the best kid. And outside air is the best thing to offer them. It's safe, it's free, doesn't cost you any money, and they have so much fun. You have to basically drag them back into the house, and that's like the worst. Saying like, let's go home, and the kid's like, no. So I've had to drag over 50 kids at home, and they're not happy with me. But when they get home and they eat something, they're like, okay, I had a good time. As a community member using this park, safety, family engagement, the park being cared for by the city officials are supposed to care for it. And the homeless people came into the park and they started sleeping in the park. And then the drug users were leaving needles on the floor. So the kids have to sidestep the needles, remind them not to pick up the needles. So that's been very critical.
Yet, in addressing these resiliency and infrastructural challenges, compelling new opportunities emerge to embed solutions for other known community risks, like extreme heat, obesity, safety, education, environmental and social injustice.
Today, as you can see, the park is really largely about athletics. So there's a lot of ball fields and the stadium, and then there's not really a whole lot else to do. So equity and diversity come to play when we start to think about programming the park. That's one way. So, to begin with, we really have started to look at new types of things to do in the park. So the more we can diversify things like, escape plaza, for example, or improving the playground, or making some better basketball courts, a community space, an event space, different kinds of things for different people to do in the park is a really important aspect of how we diversify the users.
In creating a berm for flood protection, there was also the opportunity to create new topography and add new biodiversity to the site. This created new nodes for recreation, opportunities to restore natural habitat, and manage stormwater effectively using green infrastructure. Through resiliency efforts, the team was able to restitch the park into the urban fabric, and connect seamlessly with the waterfront. Championing multimodal transportation and safe access to other adjacent public open spaces like Harbor Walk, a 43-mile linear park along Boston's shoreline, present linkages that will benefit Bostonians well into the future.
Moakley is really exciting. It's a 60-acre park. It's Boston's largest harborfront park, but one with a whole series of access problems. How do you get to the park? And once you're in the park, how do you connect to the harbor, which is just across the street, but seemingly so far away? With the renovation plans, we've really focused on designing the park in 3 major areas. The first along the city edge, all the way along Old Colony Avenue and Columbia Road. The idea being to create a whole series of activity areas that give program activities and constantly changing events for the community members who live right across the street and just around the corner. With that comes safe access, safe crossings to the park, raised bike lanes, areas to walk, areas to sit, and areas that are organized by age group so that young kids, elders, and everybody in between have a series of places that they can go to. How is it that we make parks like this more accessible to all of our community members, particularly those that have been historically disadvantaged, particularly those that are brown and black skinned, and just simply don't have access to large scale parks like this.
The Moakley Park Resiliency Plan represents a rare opportunity to create a modern 21st century community park that addresses pressing climate change needs while also prioritizing social, cultural, economic, and environmental equity. The planning process has been inclusive, deliberative, and responsive to community needs, and will result in a park that is safe, biodiverse, culturally rich, and recreationally expansive.
Great. So as you might imagine, this has been an initiative and a project where community engagement has been intense and really quite deliberate to invite newer and expansive audiences to the table. That effort is continuing, and the work is moving into phase 1 construction documents with an anticipated groundbreaking in 2023. So very exciting and lots of good things ahead.
Chris, that was wonderful. So exciting.
Thanks.
It's my second watch, and even better the second time. It's great.
Excellent.
Thank
Great.
you so much. Keith, do you want to jump in and share with us your presentation? We'll come back and do our Q&A with all 3 presenters in a moment.
Sure. Thank you so much. All right. Looks good, Carrie? Perfect. Yeah, so my name is Lad Keith, and I'm an assistant professor of planning at the University of Arizona, where I study climate change and urban planning, but specifically focus on extreme heat planning and governance. And so today I'll give a little bit of a primer on extreme heat planning and equity, and then happy to dive into some more of the equity considerations during our Q&A. So of course, extreme heat is an underestimated and increasing climate risk. And so we think about the 5 big climate risks: wildfire, sea level rise, urban flooding, drought, and extreme heat. I would say extreme heat is most like drought, where it's invisible and largely unseen to the public eye. But the governance structure around drought, of course, was started with urgency after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And so kind of looking at the calendar and where we're at right now, extreme heat is just now beginning with planning and governance around that. So almost 100 years behind drought. And of course, we've been doing flooding planning with urgency since the 1950s and 60s. So much further behind. But what we're looking at is continued increases in the intensity, duration, and frequency of extreme heat events like heat waves, but also the continual rise in average temperatures. And of course, those two things are very connected, as you can see in the graph, where a small rise in that increase in the average temperatures leads to that tail end on the right-hand side with much more hot weather and much more extreme hot weather than we've never seen before or never experienced before in the modern era. Of course, this is being driven by climate change and then also how we plan and design the built environment. So particularly for heavily urbanized cities with the urban heat island effect. And I won't go through this too much since we don't have a lot of time, but the urban heat island effect is of course influenced by things like land use and cover change, the way that we build and design the urban form, so building height, density, and arrangement, the types of building materials and the reflectivity of those materials, and then reductions in vegetation, influences from humidity from things like streams and ponds, and then also waste heat emission. So vehicle use is a big contributor to the urban heat island effect, and things like air conditioning and all of the mechanical processes that buildings and vehicles take. And so one important thing to note here, of course, is that it's the whole agglomeration of an urban area that contributes to the urban heat island effect. And so dense, compact, well-designed cities can have a lower urban heat island effect than kind of sprawling, suburban, heavily vegetated metropolitan areas. So density does not necessarily have to equal higher urban heat island effect. So of course, there's a lot of impacts from extreme heat. So public health, it's the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, but then scores above that for heat-related illnesses. It also impacts quality of life, economic productivity and development, of course. It increases energy and water use, particularly when we have those heat wave events. And then although it is less damaging than things like flooding to physical property, it does have impacts on infrastructure and urban systems too. So whether that's delaying flights in an airport like Phoenix or Los Angeles or Las Vegas, where it gets too hot to physically fly the planes, but then also in the Pacific Northwest heat wave. This last summer, we saw that some of those tram car lines were melting due to the heat because they weren't designed to operate at that threshold. Impacts landscapes and ecology, both within cities and then of course across the wild landscapes as well. And then importantly, conflicts with a lot of our urban planning goals. And so we're trying to create more dense downtowns, get people out and walking. And again, if we incorrectly design those downtowns and if the temperatures are rising, it's going to be harder to convince people to use kind of non-automobile ways of transportation. I have these two pictures here. One's of the Southwest heat wave that we experienced last week. So where I'm at in Tucson, Arizona, and then that image of the Pacific Northwest heat wave, just to kind of hammer the point home that no place is safe from heat in the United States or across the world, but how we experience heat is very different. And so although our heat wave was record-breaking in the Southwest last year, we actually experienced more heat deaths, heat-related deaths outside of official heat wave periods. And of course, that Pacific Northwest heat wave, the current death toll is over 1,200 people across the United States and Canada from that event. And so, so different types of risks, but risks nonetheless across the United States. So of course, this ties into heat equity very closely. And so we've known for quite a while that there's increased heat health risks to vulnerable populations. So particularly the elderly, people experiencing homelessness, children, and those outdoor workers. But there's also a legacy of racist land use practices that the planning profession unfortunately contributed to. So things like redlining, where those neighborhoods are still hotter today, research has shown, than their whiter and wealthier counterparts. And so a lot of that's due to things like vegetation and kind of investments in infrastructure. And you can see an image, two images on the right-hand side of two neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Of course, the upper neighborhood being lower income and the bottom, more heavily vegetated neighborhood being higher income. And so kind of thinking through all of the systematic inequities with extreme heat. So financial and physical access to healthcare, affordable and reliable energy for home cooling, and whether states allow energy shutoffs, and kind of that always affects lower income residents more. Housing quality and availability, and then safe and reliable transportation, and of course thermal safety, both at the workplace, so whether it's working in an agricultural field or working in an Amazon warehouse, and then also discrepancies in school investments. And of course, richer schools probably have better indoor cooling systems and better shaded playgrounds than those poorer schools. So you can kind of see here that those systematic inequities really go across all planning issues, and heat has an impact on all of those. So we'll share results from a couple of papers really quickly. So we did a literature review of heat planning research and found that 60% of those papers were written in the last 5 years. So just kind of shows that, again, we haven't really paid attention to heat and planning until very recently, but it's definitely picking up in speed for the amount of research and practice literature that's looking at it. Through that literature review, we really found that there were two major categories of siloed extreme heat strategies. So one was efforts to mitigate heat in the built environment or reduce that urban heat island effect. And that was really the domain of urban planning, architecture, landscape architecture. We found that the focus was very much on the public realm. And so things like urban forestry campaigns, parks, changing public right-of-way landscape design versus regulating private development, which I think is really important. And then the benefits, of course, are context specific depending on your geography and type of city that you are planning for. The other was heat management, and that's the idea of preparing and responding for heat risk. And that's really the domain of public health and emergency management. And we found that those two areas, heat management and heat mitigation, were very much separated and not a lot of talking or collaboration going on between those. And with heat management, we found that the focus is very much focused on preparing and responding to extreme heat waves versus chronic heat risk. And again, for those of us in hotter places like the Southwest, we actually have more heat deaths from chronic temperatures than we do from heat waves. So kind of thinking through the implications of that. Of course, there's complexities and trade-offs and maladaptations with heat. And so kind of looking at the cost benefit of how communities can decide to invest in mitigation and management strategies and how those interact with each other, the scale of strategy versus the scale of benefit. One example would be if you paint a roof white for an apartment building that's maybe like a 3-story tall apartment building, that might reflect the heat from that apartment building and help the regional urban heat island effect. And it might also help that building stay a little bit cooler, but that's not going to cool a pedestrian on the street next to that building. And so kind of thinking through all of the different types of heat that a city experiences. Weighing trade-offs between heat mitigation and other goals. And so an image there of green stormwater in Tucson, Arizona. Infrastructure, and of course, thinking through the amount of water that things like trees take in the desert. And of course, we also have water conservation goals because we're in a mega drought. And so kind of thinking through those different implications of those different goals that we're trying to go for. A danger of maladaptation in heat mitigation strategies. And of course, this one ties directly into equity. So as cities that have lower air conditioning adoption rates, like the Pacific Northwest, have those air conditioning adoption rates rise, those are likely going to be taking place with higher income folks that can afford air conditioning. But as we see air conditioning adoption rates rise, that there's potential for greenhouse gas emission increases. And so thinking through how can we weatherize homes and make sure that indoor cooling is also available to lower income folks that need it as well. And then on the right-hand side, with sustainability, we are doing a lot of energy efficiency efforts already, and we're just not talking about the unrecognized kind of heat reduction benefits for the urban heat island effect that those have as well. So I'll go through a survey really quickly. We did a survey of planners across the United States on extreme heat. And you can see here basically very high concern amongst those planners that we surveyed for extreme heat in their communities, and then both concern over climate change and the urban heat island effect. These are just the reported heat impacts from those planners, and see that energy, water use were the top 2, urban vegetation and wildlife was the 3rd, and then health was the 4th, and kind of going down the list there. Information sources that are used for heat planning. You can see a lot of planners are using vegetation and tree maps. They understand the heat index and they rely on historic temperature data. I think ties into the upcoming climate change PAS report, but less planners are using things like future climate change scenarios, future projections, and those heat vulnerability maps they're saying are not accessible to them. And so all areas that we need to improve kind of the accessibility for. Again, these are the strategies that those planners reported using to plan for heat. And again, divided out between heat mitigation strategies and heat management. Just pointing out that urban forestry is the top strategy, and that's kind of across the literature, but we found that in the survey too. And also pointing out that regulations, again, regulations of the private development and using zoning and other land use controls was the lowest reported heat mitigation strategy. Although, of course, private sector development is a huge part of the built environment, and so we need to think through as planners how we can get that, how we can think through heat and its impact in the private sector as well. And then for heat management strategies, we'll just point out that vulnerability assessments was one of the lower reported ones, and obviously thinking through equity implications of that, that would be something that we would want to work on as well. And so I'll just close out here. I wrote a paper that was published in Nature last October, and we really looked at heat governance holistically. So not just planning for heat, but how we govern heat as a climate risk, not just at the local level, but also at the state and national level. And here we defined heat governance as the actors, strategies, processes, and institutions that guide decision-making for mitigating and managing heat as a hazard. And I think that urban planners have a very important role to play in that, not just because I am an urban planner who researches heat governance, but because we have a history of caring about public health. We have those land use controls that do influence the form of the built environment. And we're also very interdisciplinary discipline that's used to working across those aisles with all of those other really important disciplines that come into play with heat. And so here with 6 guiding principles for both researchers and decision makers, we called on advancing heat equity in everything the governments do, looking at both mitigating and managing heat holistically, developing metrics, and so deciding whether you want to reduce heat-related illnesses or mortality, or whether you're looking at a land surface temperature map and specifically targeting areas to reduce that urban heat island effect, but really coming up with specific metrics that can track the progress that we're making with heat. Coordinating issues, not just across the local levels, but across all levels of government, and then building heat institutions. And I think I'll close out by saying that's probably one of the most important things that planners can play a role in, because as some folks on the Zoom may know, there's been a couple of chief heat officers appointed in the United States. So last year, the first one was appointed for Miami-Dade County. The city of Phoenix followed and has a new heat office and a new chief heat officer. And then Los Angeles was the third that appointed a chief heat officer late last fall. So that's 3 cities out of the 20,000 plus local governments in the United States, right, that now have a dedicated person for heat. And I know a lot of the smaller communities and even medium-sized communities do not have the resources to appoint a one-point person for dealing with heat. And so kind of thinking through what would a heat institution look like in your local community. And I think planners can play a really important role in maybe convening some of those people, like those public health officials and emergency managers, to talk about heat and to start coordinating those efforts at the local level. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to discuss more in that Q&A session that we have coming up. And I'll just note that I'm the lead author of an APA PAS report on urban heat resilience that, due to a NOAA grant, will be freely available both to APA members and non-APA members. And that will be published late spring of this year. So that's coming up pretty soon.
Lad, that was fantastic. Thank you. You got through so much information so quickly. It was great. And also, I'm sorry for calling you Keith. I practiced multiple times and then called it you, and you can call me Hewlett.
It happens all the time, don't worry.
I'm sure it does. Thanks so much, Lad. All right, Edith, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am here and ready. Let me... so hopefully you're seeing my background right now. Oh, now hopefully you're seeing my background.
Yes.
And hopefully now you're seeing my presentation.
We are. Looks great.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Edith Hannigan. I'm the executive officer at the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. The California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is a 9-member governor-appointed body that works, that is part of CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which is the state's wildland firefighting agency. So the board typically writes policies and regulations relating to forestry and fire protection, and CAL FIRE is the agency that goes out and implements most of that work. I've been at the board for almost 9 years now, and I've worked on mostly everything in that fire protection side of things. So a lot of land use planning and wildfire, and things like defensible space and vegetation management. But I recently became the executive officer, so my portfolio certainly is going to increase. Thank you for inviting me to chat with you folks today about inequity and wildfire and planning. Some background information, because I know we have a really diverse audience here. Wildfire season is growing longer. There are longer periods of hot and dry weather. Warmer winters are producing less snowpack, which is leading to droughts. Hot and dry winds are literally increasing their speed. Overgrown and drier forests are leaving more fuel on the ground, more vegetation on the ground for these fires to burn. So these fires are burning more intensely, which has ecological impacts. And then there's also been residential incursion into the area called the wildland urban interface, which is the area where wildlands either abut or intersect with the built environment. So we have more people moving deeper and deeper into the wildlands. When more people move into the wildlands, the wildfire risk increases, because I think I read a statistic that something along the lines of 84% of wildfires have some kind of human cause. So as more people move into the wildlands and they are, using a weed whacker or a mower on a hot day, or a community starts experiencing increased homelessness, and or there's people camping, hunting, recreating, and starting campfires. All of that human impact on the wildlands leads to more wildfire ignitions. So when we talk about inequities with wildfire, there's a couple different ways to think about this. First of all, there's inequities just looking at who is directly at risk from wildfires. So at the household level, a lack of disposable income prevents mitigation work, like there's been a lot of research on the building structure components that are more resistant to wildfires. But those requirements in California have only become law since 2008. And I know in other states, they're frequently recommended mitigation measures, not required. So we have a lot of housing stock that is not built to with any fire resistant capabilities. And if you don't have the disposable income to, for example, replace your roof with something more resistant to fire, or enclosing your eaves or upgrading your windows, your house remains at significant risk in a wildfire. And you also don't have the disposable income to do things like defensible space around your property, clearing your brush regularly, and really performing that landscaping work that also reduces your risk. And then if you're at the community level, if you have a more limited tax base or a smaller tax base, and less resources, it means your municipality or your community has fewer resources for comprehensive planning and preparedness. Your community might be doing the bare minimum to comply with planning and development laws, because that's all that they have the resources for, is just strict compliance with the law. And again, in a lot of states, California, a lot of this work is mandated. In a lot of other states, it's simply optional. So when presented with, keep your core services running or perform this optional planning, a community with fewer resources is obviously going to try to keep their core systems running. And then, for example, I tried to, knowing this is a national presentation, I like to try to find examples outside of California. So for example, a U.S. Forest Service study found that poor households in Washington state are more likely to be in areas with low or no fire response capabilities, which means that if there is a fire that starts and it's threatening homes, there's no resources available to try to put it out quickly. And there are reasons why you might want to let a wildfire burn. There are some fires there are ecological systems that rely on healthy wildfire to regenerate and regrow. But in the instance when that fire is directly threatening homes or other structures, you do want fire response in there to prevent those losses. But if you don't have a fire response, then there's that fire has the opportunity to grow out of control and burn down a lot more structures. So those are some inequities that we find when we're looking at people who are directly impacted by wildfire, who are at risk from their home or their community burning in a wildfire. But there's also some inequities in what I'm calling indirect wildfire risk. So these are, risks caused by wildfires that are sort of secondary to the actual fire itself. So of course, wildfire smoke exacerbates asthma and other health issues that are in low-income communities. Anybody living in the West in the last couple of years has certainly, even if you don't have breathing or respiratory health issue, man, the air quality has been terrible in the summers. There, you could live in the extremely urbanized Bay Area in California and still experience significant respiratory issues from wildfire smoke that's happening from a wildfire that's happening hundreds and hundreds of miles away. I think even the Western wildfires, I think it was this past year, the wildfire smoke managed to blow across the country and get some dark skies in the New York City, Boston areas. I know my family on the East Coast was texting me photos, and the air quality was better here in Sacramento, closer to where the wildfires were burning than it was on the East Coast. So this is truly a national level issue where when this wildfire smoke can travel across the country like that. And then a lot of wildfires lately have been started with utility equipment that's been failing. So that's power lines out in the wildland urban interface that are traversing through our forested areas to bring our communities power. A lot of electric utility companies have been instigating these public safety power shutoffs on high wind days, on dry days. They've been preemptively shutting off power to some communities in order to de-energize their lines. So if one of their line won't start, it won't be electrified, so it won't start a wildfire. But regulations, food spoilage, being able to buy a generator to keep your house, to keep your critical infrastructure running, people on medication that needs to be kept cold, or medical devices that rely on electricity. That also has impacts on people who are maybe not may not directly experience a wildfire, but their power has been shut off to prevent a wildfire from occurring. So that's another way that we have some indirect wildfire risks and inequities present there. And then finally, we also have, of course, inequities in rebuilding. When an entire community burns, construction equipment and construction laborers become really scarce. So those prices start rising. People who are or underinsured don't have the resources to rebuild. Wealthy and white communities and wealthy and white households are more likely to receive that post-disaster FEMA hazard mitigation funding. There's fewer resources out there for renters, and language access is a big problem as well. Rebuild, if you have a language barrier there, you're not going to be aware of the resources out there for you. And so that is my extremely short presentation on the wildfire inequities. I'm happy to open our Q&A and start taking questions for myself, Chris, or Lad. And I hope this was informative and interesting for you.
Great.
Give me a moment and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Edith.
There
That
you
was
go.
really, really interesting. And I think, and I'm pretty sure this is going to happen, but yep, I see Chris and I see Edith, and I think Lad, we will look for you too. Great. Well, guys, this is really, really good. And there are already some questions coming into the Q&A, but I'm going to give people a minute to continue to add some of those questions in and just ask you a few questions myself. So, and I'm going to kind of start with Lad, if that's okay. Lad, I'm curious how you guys think about, from a heat perspective, the balance between personal responsibility for people to take care of their own bodies during, to avoid the impacts of extreme heat, and the policies and sort of systemic changes we need. And let me give you what I mean by that. Obviously people who have AC in their home, AC in their car, and AC at work basically don't experience the heat. So it could be 120 degrees outside, and it is sometimes in Phoenix, and they just don't see it. They don't understand it, right? And that's because they are living in a situation that privileges them. And then there are people who don't have AC at home, don't have AC at work, and maybe take public transportation. And there's a lot of communication to try to explain to people, if it's hot outside, wear these cooling jackets, take water with you, all of that. So it puts quite a lot of sort of burden on people to manage that for themselves. And, clearly we need both, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that balance between sort of the systemic changes that might be needed to protect people and people having to hold that sort of burden of managing their own, their own exposure.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we can do a better job of communicating heat risk, even to those that have the ability to afford indoor cooling or cars with air conditioning, things like that. So I think, we are pretty far behind even in communicating that heat risk to the general public. And again, those that can afford to make those changes. And, for a lot of those folks that you mentioned, and being in Tucson, the most that heat may bother us is maybe we kind of shift our recreation outdoor activities to early in the evening or late in the afternoon or in the morning or something like that. But I think because it impacts, it inequitably impacts the lower income marginalized communities the most. It's systematic changes that we really need to make. And kind of one of the things that I point to a lot is a lot of cities are scrambling to set up cooling centers and figure out how those work now. And I think that's an okay solution for now, because we do need cooling centers that are positioned in places where those populations that need them can go and access them during heat wave events. But the fact that we need cooling centers really points to the fact that those folks don't have safe homes with indoor cooling in the first place, right? Because if they had safe environments that they were living in and working in, we wouldn't need public cooling centers for emergencies. And so I think kind of it's a Band-Aid solution, and we really need to solve people's housing quality and housing accessibility too. And so you can kind of look across the spectrum of topics that I mentioned, but like workplace safety is one of the other ones, where most white collar workers, people with offices, if you're working at home, you probably have air conditioning and a computer and internet and all of that. It's the folks that don't have safe housing, probably also don't have safe workplaces. And again, could be an Amazon warehouse, could be a restaurant, like in the back of a restaurant that's too hot. Could be delivery folks that are out and about outdoors all day long. Could be agricultural workers, construction workers too. So kind of across the whole spectrum of population.
Thank you, Lad. And Lad, I'm going to direct a couple questions to Chris and Edith, and I just want you to see that there are a few questions specifically for you in the Q&A, so you can be looking at those and kind of getting ready for them. Edith, I'm going to jump to you. And first, beautiful photos in your presentation. That one that you took in the forest with the light coming through, lovely. I want to know, Edith, you talked about the fact that fire you said sort of this kind of planning is optional, and so lower resource communities don't tend to do it, of course, because they have to keep their core functions going. Can you say a little bit more about what's expected in that kind of planning, and maybe give us some examples of really good plans that you've seen from a particular municipality?
Yeah, sure. So some of the things that California requires is, for example, in our general plan, or what other people might call their master plan or their comprehensive plan, we require communities to evaluate their wildfire hazard risk and then make sure that they're siting their housing and critical infrastructure as much as possible outside of those zones. We look for programs where we look for programs for communities to look into expanding their evacuation, noticing and planning and capacity there. We look for programs for that could be community-wide programs to encourage mitigation of existing non-conforming structures. Looking at things at making sure your road network is constructed in a way that can handle emergency traffic and evacuations coming and going at the same time. You know, that we're not putting in a 500 unit development at the end of a 5 foot wide 5 mile dead end road in a forested environment. You know, doing things like that, just being really thoughtful about how and where you place your housing. And if you do have to, if you know, the only spot in your community that's left is an area that's at relatively higher wildfire risk, what are you doing to mitigate that risk to that community? Are you letting it build business as normal, or are you going to require that in this particular section of the community, you do have to build to stricter building standards, or your streets do have to be wider, or you do have to have, stored water somewhere? What are you doing to protect the people that you are allowing to build in harm's way? And in terms of communities that have good safety, have done very good planning, we have seen, I'm going to have to look it up, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of really great general plan safety elements come in front of the board lately. The board reviews them for adequacy of wildfire planning. There's a lot of Southern California communities that are doing a good job. Santa Barbara has a really great planning program. Oakland, the city of Oakland, has a really good program. So there's there's a lot of great places in California that are doing that work.
It'd be very interesting to compare some of those measures that you guys are looking for with measures that would be required for another climate impact. I'm thinking about your transportation requirement, for example, not to have a huge multi-unit building at the end of a street that has to be evacuated. That's clearly relevant to flooding, right? So very interesting. Chris, can I ask you to talk a little bit? This Moakley Park project is so fascinating, and I of course have a bias because I know Moakley Park and live in the area. But I am so interested in the kinds of things you guys learned along the way because of your deep community engagement. In particular, I thought it was interesting that you named the diversity of programming that would be required, or that you were hoping to design for, as a DEI outcome, right? So you're trying to accommodate for more kinds of people using the park, and I think that's very interesting. And I thought I imagined that was something that maybe you guys went into the project knowing to some extent, but then really learned through the community engagement what that meant, what that looked like, what they needed. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, or even talk more about what did you learn from your community engagement that you did not know going into it? Like what really changed in the project because of the community engagement?
Yeah, thanks. There are so many factors that were brought to the table. One of the first was this issue of stormwater being the immediate threat, as opposed to coastal inundation 30 years out, which was much harder for people to grapple with, right? They know what they're dealing with now. They know when they can't play ball, right? And so that was front and center, one of the immediate things. On some of the other issues, oftentimes we start with questions about, just give us your impressions of the park. What are your biggest concerns? What doesn't work for you? What are the basic needs you have in your community? Whoever you are, right? What's not being accommodated? And what we learned through that process was this heavy dependence on athletic fields, particularly baseball fields, was not at all serving the multi-ethnic Black and brown communities immediately next door. They were looking for playgrounds that were easily accessible. They were looking for opportunities for places to grow food within the public realm. And this is one that, you know, we always think about as designers, and certainly think about in places that don't have great access to fresh food. And that becomes a long conversation with clients and city authorities, because up until that moment, that's not somewhere that the city parks department wanted to go. It actually took 2.5 years of conversation, and one of the community members in Merril and McCormick saying, I'll head that up. I've got this initiative. I've got this connections. Let's test it out in some of the spaces that are already there. That was a breakthrough, and really allowed the city to get on board, to say the risk maybe is lesser than they had anticipated, and frankly, the demand was really higher. So one of the major entry points now to the park is a plaza that's accessible to everybody, but really features community-grown food as its centerpiece program. So that was one piece. The other piece I would say that was a huge piece of learning through the process, and mind you, COVID hit during the process. And of course, we were terribly concerned with people having the right kind of access to be able to give us input on the project. But we very, very quickly learned that, particularly for the folks who lived in the public housing, getting food onto the table, keeping their kids healthy, and dealing with school were above anything else their priorities, right? Talking about the park and what it might be in 10 years was not a priority. And that's for the folks that we could reach out to in digital formats that had access. And so we spent a lot of time thinking that through, working with a number of consultants, as things started to very slowly pick up for outdoor engagement activities, we started to understand that we needed to provide very basic things that are far beyond the scope of an open space project, like a mobile vaccination clinic, as part of any kind of activity that we were inviting people to, right? Opportunities for, ice cream for kids, so that there was something there. And so it became about what could the project offer to the community that fulfilled some basic needs, partly in exchange to be able to have a conversation about some of these other issues as well. And that was a huge piece of learning, I think, for everybody involved in the project.
That is fascinating, Chris. That food as the centerpiece of the entryway, you just could never have anticipated that would be important, that you only get that from deep community engagement. That is really fascinating. We also did a community engagement project right during the pandemic and had to completely alter our way of reaching people because they just didn't care about what we were asking. They, as you said, had basic needs to meet. Lad, I'm just going to turn it over to you to answer whichever question live you would like to. Just maybe tell people which one it is that you're answering so they also can scroll through and see. There are at least two I see in the Q&A and I think one in the chat. So just pick maybe one or two of them.
Yeah, so I could try to tackle both quickly. So the first is about information sources and kind of like how do you read urban heat island maps and do you use land surface temperature? So I'll just very quickly say heat is super complex and you almost need a degree in climatology, public health, and like urban planning to really understand it. And so urban heat island maps that most planners have access to are usually satellite derived land surface temperature maps. So kind of like the temperature if you put your hand on the ground. That's different than air temperature. So the temperature you actually feel, and probably the airport reports or the phone, the temperature that you see on an app on a phone, which is also different than how you actually experience heat. And that's called thermal comfort. And so to calculate thermal comfort, you actually need a combination of kind of the radiant heat from things like the sun and the built environment, that air temperature. It takes into account like wind speed and then also humidity. And so kind of like being under shade means you'll feel different than if you were out in a field and if there was wind going by you. So we use wet bulb globe temperature as one of the things that OSHA uses to regulate some activities for athletic events or the military exercises and stuff. And so so kind of backing back up, urban heat island maps can be useful. They certainly are a good starting point for communities to look at potential problem areas in their community where they may want to invest more in heat mitigation. But you almost have to go on the site level also to really understand what's going on with heat on the site. And so we've done some studies of when we had those outdoor COVID vaccination sites in Arizona, we were called in to do some studies to see the difference in heat of a volunteer standing in a parking lot versus someone that was underneath a tent versus someone that was under a tent with cooling. And the difference was sometimes 10 to 15 degrees of that wet bulb globe temperature, meaning even at that same site, you can have a vastly different kind of thermal comfort experience. And so again, the urban heat island map isn't going to tell you how humans are experiencing heat on the site, but it gives you a good big picture level kind of understanding of potential problem areas. And the second question is just about trees. And so I would say like urban forestry, green infrastructure are certainly some of the top strategies that communities are looking at. But again, part of the reason for that is that they're already being used for things like flooding. So communities are kind of already investing in them. So it's the co-benefits idea where you can say like, okay, we're also addressing heat through a lot of the trees and green infrastructure that we're doing. So that is a good thing, but I would say we're not using the full suite of strategies available to us as planners to really address heat. And again, regulating the private development that comes through, every single private development that we allow to happen without thinking about heat is potentially increasing the heat in the built environment. And so, you know, it doesn't have to be the only factor that we consider as those development approvals come through, but we certainly should think about parking lot sizes, the amount of vegetation, the land surface land surface changes with vegetation and things like that. And so that just needs to be something that we need to consider along with all of the other suite of things that we consider as planners. And again, we're doing urban forestry and green infrastructure because it doesn't require any changes to regulations. And I know that we're in an anti-regulation environment and it's hard to ask developers to do more sometimes. But I think it's really important that we start to see like what incentives and what kind of changes we can make for those private developments coming through with heat, and not just relying on kind of trees and public parks and green infrastructure to think that that'll solve the heat problem, because it just can't by itself. And I'd say in the same way, that's why cool surfaces for roads is becoming popular too, because guess what? A lot of roads are public, and that's another kind of public action that we can take. So.
Can I add to that a little bit? There are many cities now taking on urban forestry and heat projects. The city of Boston is interesting. They have an urban forestry plan underway that we're helping to lead. And in parallel with that, an urban heat study that another team is leading. And these things do intersect, but they're not exclusive and identical overlaps. And so they're taking it on. The challenge is, of course, as Lad is saying, is, we're looking at private lots where no redevelopment is happening, but people do have jurisdiction over what happens on their own private lot, redevelopment areas, and multi-jurisdictional public pieces of land and infrastructure at the city, state, and federal level as well. And so a lot of the focus right now is on integration of forestry and heat strategies into any kind of project that might come along. And so the team is really working to develop, for instance, if you have a road repair project, that project will typically now include safe bike lanes, and in the future will now include ideas and metrics for how you create greenways that allow for cool and safe pedestrian passage along those, not just plopping a few street trees here and there. And so how do you team agendas with other kinds of projects to get those kind of co-benefits? In LA, the work that we're doing LA, one of the issues there is you have a lot of older palm trees. And palm trees, these really tall things, which are incredibly iconic, do not produce much shade at all. And so there is conversation there about how we introduce species that are adapted to urban environments that can produce more shade, but also might be able to replace those iconic palms with something equally compelling that captures people's imagination and becomes part of the identity of the city. And so it's not just the technical aspects of those projects that are in play, but some of these other aspects are as well. And right now in Los Angeles, working with the city forester and some nonprofit organizations, Tree People is one of them, we're really focusing the effort on lower income, Black and brown multi-ethnic communities that typically don't have street trees, and using the public right-of-way of streets, which are generally oversized anyway, as the focus area for these initiatives.
And Carrie, I was just thinking, and there's a connection to Edith's presentation and work too, because it's not, again, it's so context specific, thinking across all of these different climate risks, but I would not advise a mountain community that's under risk for wildfire, wildfire hazard, to plant a lot of trees in like a wildland urban interface where they're actually trying to reduce fire risk. And so sometimes you just come across these different hazards that sometimes there are co-benefits, and then sometimes you just have to make decisions based on which hazard might be actually more hazardous to that community too.
Yeah, that I was just going to say, Edith, maybe you could follow up on the idea of adding a bunch more trees into urban areas. Edith, you probably do want to comment on some of this that Chris and Lad have been talking about, but will you also take that question that's in the Q&A? Did you see it?
About
Okay,
managed
great.
forest fires?
Yeah, please. Thanks.
Yeah, I love talking about managed forest fires. Managed forest fires are so important. Like I mentioned in my presentation, there are a lot of ecosystems that rely on a healthy cycle of fire coming through. And I don't want to call it wildfire necessarily, but especially a lot of the forest ecosystems on the Pacific coast rely on some level of fire returning to the ecosystem to help with seed sprouting, to clear out undergrowth, so that a lot of indigenous communities rely on what we like to call good fire sometimes to because it the word I'm looking for is escaping me, but it helps germinate, plants that are used for medicine or basket weaving and things like that. And having that type of good fire where it's controlled, the level of severity is appropriate for the ecosystem services that depend on it, letting a fire burn through a forest that relies on it to be healthy is a very good thing. And it does reduce the risk of a massive high severity wildfire that maybe burns really hot and damages the soil underneath or damages the substrate underneath. Because what it's done is it clears out a lot of the undergrowth that otherwise in an overstocked forest would have resulted. And then if a true wildfire comes through, it doesn't burn as hot, it doesn't burn as high severity. The ecological conditions there are healthier, and it's less likely to become, a really big conflagration. So yeah, managed forest fires are a huge tool that we don't use enough of, frankly, especially in California. We have a lot of regulations around air quality. We have a lot of regulations around when and how you can burn that aren't necessarily serving us very well right now. And there's concerns about air quality, especially in the Central Valley, where we have some of the worst air quality. Adding to that by producing smoke from a prescribed fire, or adding smoke from a fire that starts, say, from lightning, but it's deep in the forest, so you want to let it burn. But that smoke is much healthier than smoke that's coming from burning down homes and other structures in really huge wildfires. So working within our regulatory systems in order to get that good fire on the ground is something that is become a really high priority for people in this field.
And Edith, you got at this a bit, and I just want to add this second half of Pallavi's question around whether or not there's some strategy around using these managed fires to protect vulnerable populations. Like I think there might be just a tiny bit of nuance there that I'd love for you to speak to if anything occurs to you.
Yeah, sure. The Forest Service has this list called the Communities at Risk list, which is a list of communities who are adjacent to or otherwise near Forest Service lands who are at risk from wildfires. And so doing work, and the idea is to prioritize doing work in and around those communities to protect them. So yeah, it would absolutely be a brilliant idea to engage with those, for the Forest Service to engage with those communities to do prescribed fire even if the fire is happening in the forest, they need to partner with those local agencies, to pass along education about, you'll be seeing smoke, but it's fine. And all of the messaging that's required, because we're so built in to see wildfire as this inherently bad thing. Working with those communities to reduce the risk of a wildfire going from the forest into that community with some type of vegetation management, whether it's prescribed fire or a shaded fuel break or something like that, can really go a long way to protecting a community, especially one that maybe doesn't have the resources for home hardening, mitigation and things like that.
And also interesting to hear about that, the list. I forgot the name that you just said, that's
Communities at Risk. Yeah.
Thank you. Chris, there is a question in here from Michelle King on just sort of generally the topic of environmental issues as social equity issues. Do you want to take that? I think it seems like STAS has been pretty focused on trying to figure out how to work with Black and Indigenous communities. And I wonder if you could take this question that Michelle has put forward.
Yeah, and Michelle's question really hits at some critical issues in terms of who's doing the work, who's leading the effort, not just the communities that we are working with. I think it's critically important. I think oftentimes it is helpful in talking to communities when those communities' backgrounds, races, ethnicities are reflected in the people that they're talking to. And so from a firm perspective, it's been really important that we hire diverse people and that those folks are part of the leadership of the firm, not just at a junior level. And so we've been making efforts, and every firm can make efforts in this way. I also teach, and so we have a lot of conversations about this as well across the school. And the Graduate School of Design at Harvard has been working on a program that actually starts at the high school level and starts to engage with kids and in part to understand what their starting points and interests are, but also to show them what design is and what the value of design is. So just introducing the field of design to kids who may not have opportunities or exposure to that explicitly. I think we do a lot of effort to then recruit now more and more multiracial, indigenous, multi-ethnic students to the school. But even as those numbers are starting to increase, both in terms of applicants and accepted candidates, once people get to a school, they have to feel like they belong there. And so that's the other critical piece. They also have to have faculty that they see that come from their own backgrounds as well. And so, all of this is to say it's such a deep and multidimensional process. And there, I know every school is starting to tackle this, but I think that the feeder system starting at the high school level, the college, and really supporting students, attracting students into the field first, and then supporting them through their education is absolutely critical to diversifying who's actually leading projects like this and who appears on panels like this one.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to add a little bit to this just from experience. I've been doing quite a lot of work on trying to figure out how do we shift power to communities of color. And one of the things that so Chris just answered, I think, the direct question that Michelle posed about getting more diverse folks into this field. And I think Michelle's referring to the field being planning broadly. And certainly all the efforts that Chris just named are really, really important, and they will take some time to take effect, right? It takes time for people to come into any field. Any field takes almost sometimes sort of a generation to actually turn over. So that's a real challenge. And so we have to get on it and we have to really move it forward, and also know that in the meantime, because the climate crisis is accelerating, we just have to find other ways as well. So one thing that came out from some work that we did recently, working with organizers, community organizers, in a sort of a bunch of communities that would be considered environmental justice communities in the Boston area, is that the community organizers have said, we need you to transfer some of your power to us, basically. You white, well-resourced organizations, planners, architects, engineers, facilitators like myself, you have relationships in the halls of power, you have money, you have access to foundations, you understand the bureaucracy, you know how to navigate these things. That power that you have, you need to see us organizers, community organizers, as the engines and drivers of the change. And we're here already, and we are doing the work of climate mitigation and climate adaptation, even if that's not what it's called, right? Housing work is climate work. Food work is climate work, right? They're dealing with the impacts of climate change. And so even if it isn't seen as climate work, it is climate work. It's dealing with those things. And so to transfer some of that power by building those relationships, transferring those relationships, providing services and technical assistance, and moving organizers, community organizers, into sort of the spaces where their power is increased, is another way that I think we can really increase the participation of people of color in this space. I just wanted to add that in there. Let's see. Edith, I think there was another question to you in the chat. Did you see that?
I didn't see one in the chat, but I see one in the, I see the chat about introducing wetlands and wet areas and reintroducing beavers. Yeah, that's certainly introducing more water would solve our problem, but most of the Western US is in a drought. So it's a little bit difficult to restore wetlands when there's no wet land to be found. But yeah, that's absolutely, for places that are prone to wildfires that have less of a drought issue right now, areas like Pennsylvania and the East Coast, that's certainly something. I see the person in the chat said that they've read about it in the West. I would be really interested to read about that. That's really cool and intersects a lot of my own personal interests in there. There is another question in the Q&A about vegetation management and extreme wildfire, which I'd love to address though, if we have time.
Yeah, go for it. And then after that, Lad, I see a question from Tamara, I think, or maybe Tamara, about cool roof strategies and that kind of thing. So maybe you can take that after Edith takes this other question from Morty.
Yeah, so Morty's question is it's a comment, but I'd like to chat about it because it's a really good point that fuels reduction and prescribed fire is a valuable tool, but its efficacy is limited in the large wildfires that we've seen in recent years. And that's absolutely true. There is no prescribed fire vegetation management project on Earth that would have stopped the campfire from burning down Paradise. That's just not, it's with the way the winds were blowing and the dry vegetation. Yeah, in an extreme wildfire, this type of stuff has limited impacts. There has been the successful use of prescribed fire and fuels management in some of the large fires that we've seen. Once the fire in Paradise slowed down after that first day, so in the campfire, the fire moved extremely quickly in an extremely short period of time, and burned down the town of Paradise. But once the winds died down and the fire slowed down, then fuel reduction efforts were actually able to contain the fire and to keep it from growing even larger. I also know during the Caldor fire this year, the area around Caples Lake and the Forest Service had done a ton of really great work around there. So that area didn't burn because it ran into those things. But an important thing to remember is that these huge wildfires that make national or international news are a tiny, tiny percentage of the wildfires that happen on an annual basis. I saw that question in the Q&A, and I actually went up to look in California alone in 2021. Oh, hold on, I'm sorry. In 2021 alone, there were 8,619 fires in California. And I guarantee not all of those made the news. Not even half of those made the news, I'm sure, outside of their local area, impacted area. So those are the types of fires, those other we'll say 19, let's say 19 major fires. Those other 8,600 fires are what we're thinking about when we think about using prescribed fire and fuels management to slow or stop wildfires from impacting communities. And that's also where this equity work gets really important. You know, there's a lot of people on fixed incomes in rural areas. There's a lot of people, a lot of low income folks in our rural communities. So the work that we can do to protect them from those other 8,600 wildfires that happen every year is a huge benefit to our communities.
It's fascinating and nice response too. That's a really important point that Morty made. Thank you so much. Lad, you want to jump in?
Sure. So the question is, how successful have strategies like cool roof or green roof ordinances been to reduce the urban heat island effect? And so again, I would say it's context specific, unfortunately, but the basic physics is that we know there is very strong evidence, almost conclusive evidence, that a cooler, more reflective roof is going to reduce the urban heat island effect compared to a darker, more heat absorbent roof that absorbs the heat and re-releases it at night. And then the same for a green roof. And there's been a lot of kind of scientific evidence on that as well. I think where the question that I have, and again, if you remember back to the slide where 60% of that heat planning research has been done in the last 5 years, it's still pretty new. And so what's the cumulative effect of 10% of the city's roofs going green or cool? Those are the types of questions that are being modeled right now, but we don't have many good examples like in real life to test. And so I think that kind of remains to be seen. And, you know, if you start to do cool roofs and green roofs and urban forestry and reducing parking lots, how do all of those strategies interact with each other to reduce the urban heat island effect? And then you still have a growing community where development is still probably happening at the outskirts. So I think a lot of that's being modeled right now. But I'd say despite like no like easy answer, I would say we still know enough about them that cool roofs and green roofs should be pursued. Again, if it makes sense for the context. And I would say green roofs don't make a lot of sense in a hot arid environment like the Southwest because the vegetation that's supported on roofs is not the type that's going to do much good for the urban heat island effect, and it takes a lot of water. It's a harsh environment, but in temperate climates or humid climates, green roofs makes a lot of sense. But cool roofs make even more sense in places like Arizona, you know, arid California, where there's just not a lot of water to spend on the roof. So,
Lad, since you're on tap, I have a question for you. You were talking in your presentation about you said just sort of offhandedly that heat mitigation, that in heat management, in the survey around heat management, that vulnerability assessments ranked really low. And then you said, and you can imagine the equity implications of that. I don't think I can. Can you kind of connect those dots for us? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly. So if you imagine that a community is just struggling to get an urban heat island map to even understand where potentially hotter places are. So say the community finally gets that urban heat island map and is like, okay, here's a couple of hotter areas and here's a couple of colder areas. That doesn't really tell you still where to best focus your efforts, because you still need a heat vulnerability assessment to really understand what communities and what individuals in your population are most at risk for heat illness or heat death. And so kind of thinking through a heat vulnerability assessment would be looking at the housing stock, looking at energy affordability and accessibility, looking at those census tracts that have higher cardiovascular disease or higher diabetes and those things that contribute to heat death and illness. And so a heat vulnerability assessment would really take a closer look at kind of the public health implications of heat. And those two things together could be really powerful, but just an urban heat island map by itself kind of requires you to just make a lot of assumptions about what's going on in those particular neighborhoods. And so I'd say, since there's still a number of planners watching the Zoom, even though we're at getting close to the end of it, you don't have to wait for a heat vulnerability assessment or heat vulnerability map to be created for community. I would say the second best thing is to just look at CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, which is publicly available for every census tract in the United States. And that can give you a good idea of those places, again, that have those higher kind of economic and environmental and social concerns, where you could look at that paired with an urban heat island map to make some better decisions. So.
Thanks, Lad. That's really helpful. Chris, there's a question over here in the Q&A that I think might be for you. It's about the continuous acreage, whether continuous acreage or total acreage is more important for the benefits discussed in parks and open space. Do you want to try to take that?
Yeah, sure. Both are important in different ways. Being able to have a small park within a 5-minute walk to all populations is really important. And how we begin to think about that in terms of what could be the schoolyard that's open to the public as a public park during off-school hours, those things are critically important. And in fact, many cities, Boston among them, rank very highly in that 5-minute walk metric. But what we found during the pandemic, for instance, is those were all the small spaces that were closed down immediately. And suddenly only larger parks where people could spread out and linear parks where people could, again, kind of spread out in a linear fashion. It was only those larger parks that were open to people. Frankly, it's those larger places and linear parks that allow people to exercise more, spread out, do different kinds of activities. And so we found at Moakley Park, some of the highest use, frankly, of that open space. People were out, they would drive weights to the field, and there were a lot of exercise classes that moved outdoors, which is fantastic, but you had to have a car to drive there. And so, in terms of large parks, it's harder to do these days, but it's critically important. Larger parks also allow for different kinds of activities, more biodiversity, more variety of offerings for people, and more opportunities for people from different backgrounds to intermingle as well. And so they both play really important roles in quite different ways.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Chris. With the few minutes we have, and I'm going to ask Lad, Edith, and Chris in that order, if you would, to say any sort of parting comments you might want to. And I'll just note for you guys that we want to end 2 minutes with 2 minutes to go, because Merrill is going to have some, just a couple of closing things to say. So Lad, Edith, Chris, and then it'll just go straight to Merrill. Thanks, everybody. It's been really great.
Great, thank you, Carrie, and thanks again for inviting me on the panel and to speak with everyone. I've enjoyed all the comments so far. I would just say, again, heat planning is in its infancy compared to other climate risk planning, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because we have enough information to know some strategies that work and what we should get started on. And again, I'm just looking back at that Pacific Northwest heat wave that happened last year. That could occur at any place in the world. And so there's no place that should think that it's safe from an event like that happening. And so don't wait for 10 or 20 years to kind of start your heat planning, because everyone needs to start incorporating that as a consideration for climate change planning right now. I would say, again, APA is starting to focus more on heat, and we have that planning for urban heat resilience PAS report coming out that'll be a good resources. But then also, even the federal government now has the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, NIHIS, and I'll post that link in the chat. And they have a lot of great resources too. So, and that's just a resource network that's been started up in the last couple of years. And so kind of expect to see more resources and more guidance on heat in the coming years.
Yeah, I think I'd like to piggyback off what Lad said a little bit, that the time to start planning for this stuff is now. I think if you live in an area that's that's not the right report. If you live in an area prone to wildfires, but your community doesn't require any type of regulations for mitigation, I really encourage you to be a champion for those kinds of things in your community. A recent report came out that showed that basically the uptake of wildfire mitigation measures is really limited with in areas where those are not required mitigations. So you see more fire safe construction happening in places that are requiring it versus places that list it as optional things to add to your home. And I know that there's probably going to be a lot of pushback from folks about, well, this is going to increase the cost of housing. Well, what is this going to do to our low income housing? What is this going to do? But you need to think about what the long-term costs of wildfires are, and they're much, much higher in terms of infrastructure loss, structure and home loss, that tax base loss, the health outcomes, the ecological outcomes. All of those are far higher costs than any costs, which have been proven to be minimal. Any costs that fire resistant housing might add versus the cost of conventional construction. So if you're living in one of those communities, I would really, really encourage you to start becoming a champion for incorporating. I know the relationship with regulations is complicated, but starting to incorporate that stuff into your requirements for building in fire hazard areas. There is a PIS report, a very relatively recent report that I'm trying to find right now about planning for wildfires. It was also funded with some Forest Service money, so it is also free to folks, and it's a fantastic, oh, here it is. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. It's a fantastic resource if you're looking to get started on how to incorporate wildfire hazard planning into your community planning documents. And otherwise, thank you for having me. Thank you for moderating, Carrie. This was a wonderful afternoon.
Great. And just quickly, just a couple thoughts or recommendations. One, to quote a friend of mine, a good colleague, Tony Griffin, is a planner. Make equity an intentional outcome for the climate work you're doing. If we don't, it becomes a side project. And really, to kind of address the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today, we've got to put it front and center. Second, I think, as we begin outreach on projects, I think it's useful to go 3 layers deep, meaning we, our clients, our collaborators, stakeholders can begin to identify people in community that are 1 layer deep. We bring them to the table, engage them, but then we need to ask them who their contacts are that go even deeper into those communities. And once we engage those folks, to do a 3rd layer too, because it's only once we get to the 3rd layer that we get some really, really on the ground perspectives, a true diversity of perspectives that don't just rely on the people we know or the people we know and the people they know. It really takes that multiple levels to kind of get at some of these issues. Otherwise, thanks so much. This has been such a terrific day and a terrific panel. Really appreciate all of you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I just wanted to say a huge thanks to all of our presenters for your passion, for your hard work, for sharing your insights with us today. I wanted to say thank you to our audience for posing your questions, for participating. We had a much bigger turnout than I ever expected. And for this wonderful dialogue that we have going. I wanted to thank all of our executive committee volunteers, especially Shannon, for really taking this idea of the symposium all the way to fruition, for everybody on the executive committee and the partnerships committee. And just wanted to say, join the Sustainable Communities Division if you aren't a member yet. We're going to be putting on a lot more really interesting programming stuff that's in the works, stuff that is already scheduled. So please join us, and thanks again to all of our sponsors. With that, I think we will conclude. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.